Chapter 4 of Tales of Lonely Trails by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4, Tonto Basin, Part 8. Early next morning, before the sun had tipped the pines with gold, I went down Barbershop Canyon with Copple to look for our horses. During the night our stock had been chased by a lion. We had all been awakened by their snorting and stampeding. We found our horses scattered, the burros gone, and Copple's mules still squared on guard, ready to fight. Copple assured me that this formation of his mules on guard was an infallible sign of lions prowling around. One of these mules he had owned for 10 years, and it was indeed the most intelligent beast I ever saw in the woods. We found 3 beaver dams across the brook, one about 50 feet long and another fully 200. Fresh turkey tracks showed in places, and on the top of the longer dam, fresh made in the mud, were lion tracks as large as the crown of my hat. How sight of them made me tingle all over. Here was absolute proof of the prowling of one of the great cats. Beaver tracks were everywhere. They were rather singular-looking tracks, the front feet being 5-toed, and the back 3-toed and webbed. Near the slides on the bank the water was muddy, showing that the beaver had been at work early. These animals work mostly at night, but sometimes at sunset and sunrise. They were indeed very cautious and wary. These dams had just been completed, and no aspens had yet been cut for food. Beaver usually have 2 holes in their home, one under the water and the other out on the bank. We found one of these outside burrows, and it was nearly a foot wide. Upon our return to camp with the horses, Haught said he could put up that lion for us, and from the size of its track he judged it to be a big one. I did not want to hunt lions, and R.C. preferred to keep after bears. "Wal," said Haught, "I'll take off a day and chase that lion. Had a burro killed here a couple of years ago." So we rode out with the hounds on another bear hunt. Pyle's Canyon lay to the east of Dude Creek, and we decided to run it that day. Ed and Nielsen started down with the hounds. Copple and I followed shortly afterward with the intention of descending midway and then working along the ridge crests and promontories. The other boys remained on the rim, to take up various stands as occasion called for. I had never been on as steep slopes as these under the rim. They were grassy, brushy, rocky, but it was their steepness that made them so hard to travel. Right off, halfway down, we started a herd of bucks. The noise they made sounded like cattle. We found tracks of half a dozen. "Lots of deer under the rim," declared Copple, his eyes gleaming. "They're feedin' on acorns. Here's where you get your big buck." After that I kept a sharp lookout, arguing with myself that a buck close at hand was worth a lot of bears down in the brush. Presently we changed a direct descent to work gradually along the slopes toward a great level bench covered with pines. We had to cross gravel patches and pits where avalanches had slid, and at last, gaining the bench, we went through the pine grove, out to a manzanita thicket, to a rocky point where the ledges were toppling and dangerous. The stand here afforded a magnificent view. We were now down in the thick of this sloped and canyoned and timbered wilderness, no longer above it and aloof from it. The dry smell of pine filled the air. When we finally halted to listen, we at once heard the baying of the hounds in the black notch below us. We watched and listened, and presently across open patches we saw the flash of deer, and then Rock and Buck following them. Thus were my suspicions of Rock fully confirmed. Copple yelled down to Ed that some of the hounds were running deer, but apparently Ed was too far away to hear. Still, after a while we heard the mellow tones of Ed's horn calling in the hounds, and then he blew the signal to acquaint all of us above that he was going down around the point to drive the next canyon. Copple and I had to choose between climbing back to the rim or trying to cross the slopes and head the gorges and ascend the huge ridge that separated Pyle's Canyon from the next canyon. I left the question to Copple, with the result that we stayed below. We were still high up, though when we gazed aloft at the rim we felt so far down, and the slopes were steep, stony, soft in places, and slippery in others, with deep cuts and patches of manzanita. No stranger was I to this beautiful, treacherous Spanish brush. I shared with Copple a dislike of it almost equal to that inspired by cactus. We soon were hot, dusty, dry, and had begun to sweat. The immense distances of the place were what continually struck me, distances that were deceptive, that looked short and were interminable. That was Arizona. We covered miles in our detours, and we had to travel fast because we knew Ed could round the base of the lower points in quick time. Above the head of the third gorge, Copple and I ran across an enormous bear track, fresh in the dust, leading along an old bear trail. This track measured 12 inches. "He's an old jasper, as Haught says," declared Copple. "Grizzly, and you can bet he heard the dogs and got moving away from here. But he ain't scared. He was walking." I forgot the arduous toil. How tight and cool and prickling the feel of my skin! The fresh track of a big grizzly would rouse the hunter in any man. We made sure how fresh the track was by observing twigs and sprigs of manzanita just broken. The wood was green and wet with sap. Old Bruin had not escaped our eyes any too soon. We followed this bear trail, evidently one used for years. It made climbing easy for us. Trust a big, heavy old grizzly to pick out the best traveling over rough country. This fellow, I concluded, had the eye of a surveyor. His trail led gradually toward a wonderful crag-crowned ridge that rolled and heaved down from the rim. It had a dip or saddle in the middle, and rose from that to the lofty mesa, and then on the lower side rose to a bare, round point of gray rock, a landmark, a dome-shaped tower, where the gods of that wild region might have kept their vigil. Long indeed did it take us to climb up the bear trail to where it crossed the saddle, and went down on the other side into a canyon so deep and wild that it was purple. This saddle was really a remarkable place, a natural trail and outlet and escape for bears traveling from one canyon to another. Our bear tracks showed fresh, and we saw where they led down a steep, long, dark aisle between pines and spruces to a dense black thicket below. The saddle was about 20 feet wide, and on each side of it rose steep rocks, affording most effective stands for a hunter to wait and watch. We rested then and listened. There was only a little wind, and often it fooled us. It sounded like the baying of hounds, and now like the hallooing of men, and then like the distant peal of a horn. By and by Copple said he heard the hounds. I could not be sure. Since we indeed heard the deep-sounding wild bay of old Dan, the coarse, sharp, ringing bay of old Tom, and then, less clear, the chorus from the other hounds. Ed had started them on a trail up this magnificent canyon at our feet. After a while we heard Ed yell far away, but clear, "Hi! Hi!" We could see a part of the thicket, shaggy and red and gold, and a mile or more of the opposite wall of the canyon. No rougher, wilder place could have been imagined than this steep slope of bluffs, ledges, benches, all matted with brush and spotted with pines. Holes and caves and cracks showed, and yellow blank walls, and bronze points, and green slopes and weathered slides. Soon the baying of the hounds appeared to pass below and beyond us, up the canyon to our right, a circumstance that worried Copple. "Let's go farther up," he kept saying, but I was loath to leave that splendid stand. The baying of the hounds appeared to swing round closer under us, to ring, to swell, to thicken until it was a continuous and melodious, wild, echoing roar. The narrowing walls of the canyon threw the echoes back and forth. Presently I espied moving dots, one blue, one brown, on the opposite slope. They were Haught and his son Ed, slowly and laboriously climbing up the steep bluff. How like snails they climbed! Theirs was indeed a task. A yell pealed out now and then, and though it seemed to come from an entirely different direction, it surely must have come from the Haught's. Presently some one high on the rim answered with like yells. The chase was growing hotter. "They've got a bear up somewhere," cried Copple excitedly, and I agreed with him. Then we were startled by the sharp crack of a rifle from the rim. "The ball's open. Get your partners, boys," exclaimed Copple with animation. "Ben, wasn't that a .30 Government?" I said. "Sure was," he replied. "Must have been R.C. opening up. Now look sharp." I gazed everywhere, growing more excited and thrilled. Another shot from above, farther off and from a different rifle, augmented our stirring expectation. Copple left our stand and ran up over the ridge, and then down and along the base of a rock wall. I had all I could do to keep up with him. We got perhaps 100 yards when we heard the spang of Haught's .30 Government. Following this his big, hoarse voice bawled out, "He's going to the left, to the left!" That sent us right about face to climbing, scrambling, running, and plunging back to our first stand at the saddle, where we arrived breathless and eager. Ed was climbing higher up, evidently to reach the level top of the bluff above, and Haught was working farther up the canyon, climbing a little. Copple yelled with all his might, "Where's the bear?" "Bar everywhere," pealed back Haught's stentorian voice. How the echoes clapped! Just then Copple electrified me with a wild shout. "Wee-how! I see him! What a whopper!" He threw up his rifle. Spang, 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 spang. His aim was across the canyon. I heard his bullet strike. I strained my eyes in flashing gaze everywhere. "Where? Where?" I cried wildly. "There!" shouted Copple keenly, and he pointed across the canyon. "He's going over the bench, above Ed. Now he's out of sight. Watch just over Ed. He'll cross that bench, go round the head of the little canyon, and come out on the other side under the bare bluff. Watch sharp, right by that big spruce with a dead top. He's a grizzly and as big as a horse." I looked until my eyes hurt. All I said was, "Ben, you saw game first today." Suddenly a large dark brown object, furry and grizzled, huge and round, moved out of the shadow under the spruce and turned to go along the edge in the open sunlight. "Oh, look at him!" I yelled. A strong, hot gust of blood ran over me, and I thrilled till I shook. When I aimed at the bear I could see him through the circle of my peep sight, but when I moved the bead of the front sight upon him it almost covered him up. The distance was far, more than 1,000 yards, over a half-mile, we calculated afterward, but I tried to draw a bead on the big, swagging brown shape, and fired till my rifle was empty. Meanwhile Copple had reloaded. "You watch while I shoot," he said. "Tell me where I'm hittin'." Wonderful was it to see how swiftly he could aim and shoot. I saw a puff of dust. "Low, Ben!" Spang rang his rifle. "High!" Again he shot, wide this time. He emptied his magazine. "Smoke him now," he shouted gleefully. "I'll watch while you shoot." "It's too far, Ben," I replied, as I jammed the last shell in the receiver. No, it's only we don't hold right. Aim a little coarse," said Copple. "Gee, ain't he some bear? No scared tall, as the Jap says. He's one of the old sheep killers. He'll weigh half a ton. Smoke him now." My excitement was intense. It seemed, however, I was almost consumed with admiration for that grizzly. Not in the least was he afraid. He walked along the rough places, trotted along the ledges, and here and there he halted to gaze below him. I waited for one of these halts, aimed a trifle high, and fired. The grizzly made a quick, angry movement, and then jumped up on a ledge. He jumped like a rabbit. "You hit close that time," yelled Ben. "Hold the same way, a little coarser." My next bullet struck a puff from rock above the bear, and my third, hitting just in front of him as he was on a yellow ledge, covered him with dust. He reared and, wheeling, sheered back and down the step he had mounted, and disappeared in a clump of brush. I shot into that. We heard my bullet crack the twigs, but it routed him out, and then my last shot hit far under him. Copple circled his mouth with his hands and bellowed to the Hauts, "Climb! Climb! Hurry! Hurry! He's just above you, under that bluff!" The Hauts heard and evidently tried to do all in their power, but they moved like snails. Then Copple fired 5 more shots, quick, yet deliberate, and he got through before I had reloaded. And as I began my third magazine, Copple was so swift in reloading that his first shot mingled with my second. How we made the welkin ring! Wild yells pealed down from the rim. Somewhere from the purple depths below, Nielsen's giant's voice rolled up. The Hauts opposite answered with their deep, hoarse yells. Old Dan and Old Tom bayed like distant thunder. The young hounds let out a string of sharp, keen yelps. Copple added his Indian cry, high-pitched and wild, to the pandemonium. But I could not shoot and screech at one and the same time. "Hurry, Ben," I said, as I finished my third set of 5 shots, the last shot of which was my best, and knocked dirt in the face of the grizzly. Again he reared. This time he appeared to locate our direction. Above the bedlam of yells and bays and yelps and echoes, I imagined I heard the grizzly roar. He was now getting farther along the base of the bluff, and I saw that he would escape us. My rifle barrel was hot as fire. My fingers were all thumbs. I jammed a shell into the receiver. My last chance had fled. But Copple's big, brown, swift hands fed shells to his magazine as ears of corn go to a grinder. He had a way of poking the base of a shell straight down into the receiver and making it snap forward and down. Then he fired 5 more shots as swiftly as he had reloaded. Some of these hit close to our quarry. The old grizzly slowed up and looked across and wagged his huge head. "My gun's on fire, all right," said Copple grimly, as he loaded still more rapidly. Carefully he aimed and pulled trigger. The grizzly gave a spasmodic jerk as if stung, and suddenly he made a prodigious leap off a ledge down into a patch of brush, where he threshed like a lassoed elephant. "Ben, you hit him!" I yelled excitedly. "Only made him mad. He's not hurt. See, he's up again. Will you look at that?" The grizzly appeared to roll out of the brush, and like a huge furry ball of brown he bounced down the thicketed slope to an open slide, where he unrolled and stretched into a run. Copple got 2 more shots before he was out of sight. "Gone!" ejaculated Copple. "And we never fetched him. He ain't hurt. Did you see him pile down and roll off that slope? Let's see. I got 23 shots at him. How many had you?" "I had 15. Say, it was some fun, wasn't it, smoking him along there? But we ought to have fetched the old sheep killer. Wonder what's happened to the other fellows." We looked about us. Not improbably the exciting moments had been few in number, yet they seemed long indeed. The Hauts had gotten to the top of the bluff, and were tearing through the brush toward the point Copple had designated. They reached it too late. "Where is he?" yelled Ed. "Gone," boomed Copple. "Running down the canyon. Call the dogs and go down after him." When the Hauts came out into the open upon that bench, one of the pups and the spotted hound Rock were with them. Old Dan and Old Tom were baying up at the head of the canyon, and Sue could be heard yelping somewhere else. Bear trails seemingly were abundant near our whereabouts. Presently the Hauts disappeared at the back of the bench, where the old grizzly had gone down, and evidently they put the 2 hounds on his trail. "That grizzly will climb over round the lower end of this ridge," declared Copple. "We want to be there." So we hurriedly left our stand, and taking to the south side of the ridge, we ran and walked and climbed and plunged down along the slope. Keeping up with Copple on foot was harder than riding after Ed and George. When soon we reached a manzanita thicket, I could no longer keep Copple in sight. He was so powerful that he just crashed through, but I had to worm my way and walk over the tops of the bushes like a tight-rope performer. Of all strong, thick, spiky brush, manzanita was the worst. In half an hour I joined Copple at the point under the dome-topped end of the ridge, only to hear the hounds apparently working back up the canyon. There was nothing for us to do but return to our stand at the saddle. Copple hurried faster than ever, but I had begun to tire, and I could not keep up with him. But as I had no wild cravings to meet that old grizzly face to face all by myself in a manzanita thicket, I did manage by desperate efforts to keep the Indian in sight. When I reached our stand I was wet and exhausted. After the hot, stifling, dusty glare of the yellow slope and the burning of the manzanita brush, the cool shade was a welcome change. Somewhere all the hounds were baying. Not for some time could we locate the Haughts. Finally, with the aid of my glass, we discovered them perched high upon the bluff above where our grizzly had gone round. It appeared that Ed was pointing across the canyon, and his father was manifesting a keen interest. We did not need the glass then to tell that they saw a bear. Both leveled their rifles and fired, apparently across the canyon. Then they stood like statues. "I'll go down into the thicket," said Copple. "Maybe I can get a shot. And anyway I want to see our grizzly tracks." With that he started down, and once on the steep bear trail he slid rather than walked, and soon was out of my sight. After that I heard him crashing through thicket and brush. Soon this sound ceased. The hounds, too, had quit baying, and the wind had lulled. Not a rustle of a leaf. All the hunters were likewise silent. I enjoyed a lonely hour there, watching and listening, not, however, without apprehensions of a bear coming along. Certain I was that this canyon, which I christened Bear Canyon, had been full of bears. At length I espied Copple down on the edge of the opposite slope. The way he toiled along proved how rough was the going. I watched him through my glasses, and was again impressed with the strange difference between the semblance of distance and the reality. Every few steps Copple would halt to rest. He had to hold on to the brush, and in the bare places where he could not reach a bush he had to dig his heels into the earth to keep from sliding down. In time he ascended to the place where our grizzly had rolled down, and from there he yelled up to the Haughts high above him. They answered, and soon disappeared on the far side of the bluff. Copple also disappeared, going round under the wall of yellow rock. Perhaps in 15 minutes I heard them yell, and then a wild clamor of the hounds. Some of the pack had been put on the trail of our grizzly, but gradually the sound grew farther away. This was too much for me. I decided to go down into the canyon. Forthwith I started. It was easy to go down. As a matter of fact, it was hard not to slide down like a streak. That long, dark, narrow aisle between the spruces had no charm for me anyway. Suppose I should meet a bear coming up as I was sliding down? I sheered off and left the trail, and also Copple's tracks. This was a blunder. I came out into more open slope, but steeper and harder to cling to. Ledges cropped out, cliffs and ravines obstructed my passage, and trees were not close enough to help me much. Some long slopes of dark, mossy, bare earth I actually ran down, trusting to light, swift steps rather than slow, careful ones. It was exhilarating, that descent under the shady spruces. The lower down I got, the smaller and more numerous the trees. I could see where they left off to the dense thicket that choked the lower part of the V-shaped canyon, and I was amazed at the size and density of that jungle of scrub oaks, maples, and aspens. From above the color was a blaze of scarlet and gold and green with bronze tinge. Presently I crossed a fresh bear track, so fresh that I could see the dampness of the dark earth, the rolling of little particles, the springing erect of bent grasses. In some places big sections of earth a yard wide had slipped under the feet of this particular bear. He appeared to be working down. Right then I wanted to go up, but I could not climb out there. I had to go down. Soon I was under low-spreading, dense spruces, and I had to hold on desperately to keep from sliding. All the time, naturally, I kept a keen lookout for a bear. Every stone and every trunk resembled a bear. I decided if I met a grizzly that I would not annoy him on that slope. I would say, "Nice bear, I won't hurt you." Still, the situation had some kind of charm, but to claim I was not frightened would not be strictly truthful. I slid over the trail of that bear into the trail of another one, and under the last big spruce on that part of the slope I found a hollow nest of pine needles and leaves, and if that bed was not still warm, then my imagination lent considerable to the moment. Beyond this began the edge of the thicket. It was small pine at first, so close together that I had to squeeze through, and as dark as twilight. The ground was a slant of brown pine needles, so slippery that if I could not have held on to trees and branches I never would have kept my feet. In this dark strip I had more than apprehensions. What a comfortable place to encounter an enraged or wounded grizzly bear! The manzanita thicket was preferable, but as Providence would have it, I did not encounter one. Soon I worked or wormed out of the pines into the thicket of scrub oaks, maples, and aspens. The change was welcome. Not only did the slope lengthen out, but the light changed from gloom to gold. There was half a foot of scarlet, gold, bronze, red, and purple leaves on the ground, and every step I made I kicked acorns about to rustle and roll. Bear sign was everywhere, tracks and trails and beds and scratches. I kept going down, and the farther down I got the lighter it grew, and more approaching a level. One glade was strangely luminous and beautiful, with a blending of gold and purple light made by the sun shining through the leaves overhead down upon the carpet of leaves on the ground. Then I came into a glade that reminded me of Kipling's moonlight dance of the wild elephants. Here the leaves and fern were rolled and matted flat, smooth as if done by a huge roller. Bears and bears had lolled and slept and played here. A little below this glade was a place, shady and cool, where a seep of water came from under a bank. It looked like a herd of cattle had stamped the earth, only the tracks were bear tracks. Little ones no longer than a child's hand, and larger up to huge tracks a foot long and almost as wide. Many were old, but some were fresh. This little spot smelled of bear so strongly that it reminded me of the bear pen in the Bronx Park Zoological Garden. I had been keen for sight of bear trails and scent of bear fur, but this was a little too much. I thought it was too much because the place was lonely and dark and absolutely silent. I went on down to the gully that ran down the middle of the canyon. It was more open here. The sun got through, and there were some big pines. I could see the bluff that the Haughts had climbed so laboriously, and now I understood why they had been so slow. It was straight up, brush and jumbled rock, and 200 feet over my head. Somewhere above that bluff was the bluff where our bear had run along. I rested and listened for the dogs. There was no wind to deceive me, but I imagined I heard dogs everywhere. It seemed unwise for me to go down the canyon, for if I did not meet the men I would find myself lost. As it was, I would have my troubles climbing out. I chose a part of the thicket some distance above where I had come down, hoping to find it more open, if not less steep, and not so vastly inhabited with bears. Lo and behold, it was worse. It was thicker, darker, wilder, steeper, and there was, if possible, actually more bear sign. I had to pull myself up by holding to the trees and branches. I had to rest every few steps. I had to watch and listen all the time. Halfway up, the trunks of the aspens and oaks and maples were all bent downhill. They curved out and down before the rest of the tree stood upright, and all the brush was flat, bending downhill and absolutely almost impassable. This feature of trees and brush was of course caused by the weight of snow in winter. It would have been more interesting if I had not been so anxious to get up. I grew hotter and wetter than I had been in the manzanitas. Moreover, what with the labor and worry and exhaustion, my apprehensions had increased. They increased until I had to confess that I was scared. Once I heard a rustle and pad on the leaves somewhere below. That made matters worse. Surely I would meet a bear. I would meet him coming downhill. And I must never shoot a bear coming downhill. Buffalo Jones had cautioned me on that score. So had Scott Teague, the bear hunter of Colorado, and so had Haught. Don't ever shoot no old bear comin' downhill, 'cause if you do he'll just roll up and pile down on you. I climbed until my tongue hung out and my heart was likely to burst. Then, when I had to straddle a tree to keep from sliding down, I got desperate and mad, and hoped an old grizzly would happen along to make an end to my misery. It took me an hour to climb up that part of the slope which constituted the thicket of oak, maple, and aspen. It was 3:30 when finally I reached the saddle where we had shot at the grizzly. I rested as long as I dared. I had still a long way to go up that ridge to the rim, and how did I know whether or not I could surmount it? However, a good rest helped to revive strength and spirit. Then I started. Once above the saddle, I was out clear in the open, high above the canyons and the vast basin still farther below, yet far indeed under the pine-fringed rim above. This climb was all over stone. The ridge was narrow-crested, yellow-splintered rock, with a few dwarf pines and spruces, and an occasional bunch of manzanita. I did not hear a sound that I did not make myself. Whatever had become of the hounds and the other hunters? The higher I climbed, the more I liked it. After an hour I was sure that I could reach the rim by this route, and of course that stimulated me. To make sure and allay doubt, I sat down on a high backbone of bare rock and studied the heave and bulge of ridge above me. Using my glasses, I made sure I could climb out. It would be a task equal to those of lion hunting days with Jones, and it made me happy to realize that despite the intervening 10 years I was still equal to the task. Once assured of this, I grew acute to the sensations of the hour. This was one of my especial joys of the open, to be alone high on some promontory above wild and beautiful scenery. The sun was still an hour from setting, and it had begun to soften, to grow intense and more golden. There were clouds and lights that promised a magnificent sunset. So I climbed on. When I stopped to rest, I would shove a stone loose and watch it heave and slide, and leap out and hurtle down, to make the dust fly and crash into the thicket, and eventually start an avalanche that would roar down into the canyon. The Tonto Basin seemed a vast bowl of rolling, rough, black ridges and canyons, green and dark and yellow, with the great mountain ranges enclosing it to south and west. The black-fringed promontories of the rim, bold and rugged, leagues apart, stood out over the void. The colors of autumn gleamed under the cliffs, everywhere patches of gold and long slants of green and spots of scarlet and clefts of purple. The last benches of that ridge taxed my waning strength. I had to step up, climb up, pull myself up, by hand and knee and body. My rifle grew to weigh a ton. My cartridge belt was a burden of lead around my waist. If I had been hot and wet below in the thicket, I wondered what I grew on the last steps of this ridge. Yet even the toil and the pain held a keen pleasure. I did not analyze my feelings then, but it was good to be there. The rim rock came out to a point above me, seeming unscalable, all grown over with brush and lichen and stunted spruce. But by hauling myself up and crawling here and winding under bridges of rock there, and holding to the brush, at last, panting and spent, I reached the top. I was ready to drop on the mats of pine needles and lie there, unutterably grateful for the rest, when I heard Old Tom baying deep and ringing and close. He seemed right under the rim on the side of the ridge opposite to where I had climbed. I looked around. There was George's horse tied to a pine, and farther on my own horse Stockings. Then I walked to the rim and looked down into the gold and scarlet thicket. Actually, it seemed to me then, and always will seem, that the first object I clearly distinguished was a big black bear standing in an open aisle at the upper reach of the thicket close to the cliff. He shone black as shiny coal. He was looking down into the thicket as if listening to the baying hound. I could not repress an exclamation of surprise and thrilling excitement, and I uttered it as I raised my rifle. Just the instant I saw his shining fur through the circle of my rear sight, he heard me and jumped, and my bullet missed him. Like a black flash he was gone around a corner of gray ledge. "Well," I ejaculated, suddenly weak, "after all this long day, to get a chance like that and miss!" All that seemed left of that long day was the sunset, out of which I could not be cheated by blunders or bad luck. Westward a glorious golden ball blazed over the rim. Above that shone an intense belt of color, Coleridge's yellow lightning, and it extended to a bank of cloud that seemed transparent purple, and above all this flowed a sea of purest blue sky with fleecy sails of pink and white and rose exquisitely flecked with gold. Lost indeed was I to weariness and time until the gorgeous transformation at last ended in dull gray. I walked along the rim, back to where I had tied my horse. He saw me and whinnied before I located the spot. I just about had strength enough left to straddle him, and presently through the twilight shadows I caught a bright glimmer of our camp fire. Supper was ready. Takahashi grinned his concern away. All the men were waiting for me, and like the Ancient Mariner I told my tale. As I sat to a bountiful repast, regaling myself, the talk of my companions seemed absolutely satisfying. George Haught, on a stand at the apex of the canyon, had heard and seen a big brown bear climbing up through the thicket, and he had overshot and missed. R.C. had espied a big black bear walking a slide some 400 yards down the canyon slope, and forgetting that he had a heavy close-range shell in his rifle instead of one of high trajectory, he had aimed accordingly, to undershoot half a foot and thus lose his opportunity. Nielsen had been lost most of the day. It seemed everywhere he heard yells and bays down in the canyon, and once he had heard a loud rattling crash of a heavy bear tearing through the thicket. Ed told of the fearful climb he and his father had made, how they had shot at the grizzly a long way off, how funny another bear had rolled around in his bed across the canyon. But the hounds got too tired to hold the trails late in the day, and lastly Ed said, "When you and Ben were smoking the grizzly, I could hear the bullets hit close above us, and I was sure scared stiff for fear you'd roll him down on us. But Father wasn't scared. He said, 'Let the old Jasper roll down. We'll assassinate him.'" When the old bear hunter began to tell his part in the day's adventures, my pleasure was tinglingly keen, and nothing was wanting on the moment except that my boy Romer was not there to hear. "Wal, sure it was an old bar day," said Haught, with quaint satisfaction. His blue shirt, ragged and torn and black from brush, surely attested to the truth of his words. "All told, we seen 5 bears, 2 blacks, 2 browns, and an old Jasper. Some of them big fellers, too, but we missed seein' the boss bar of this canyon. When old Dan opened up first off, I wanted Ed to climb that bluff, but Ed kept goin' and we lost our chance. for pretty soon we heard a bustin' of the brush. My, but that bar was rocking her off. He knocked the brush like a wild steer, and he ran past us close. Not 100 yards. I never heard a heavier bar, but we couldn't see him. Then Ed started up, and that bluff was a wolf of a place. We was halfway up when I seen the grizzly that you and Ben smoked afterwards. He was far off, but Ed and I lammed a couple after him just for luck. One of the pups was nipping his heels. Think it was Bigfoot. Well, that was all of that. We plumb busted ourselves getting on top of the bench to head off your bar, only we hadn't time. Then we worried along around to the top of that higher bluff, and there I was so played out I thought my day had come. We kept our eyes peeled, and pretty soon I spied a big brown bar acting queer in an open spot across the canyon. Ed seen him too, and we argued about what that bar was doing. He lay in a small open place at the foot of a spruce. He wagged his head slow, and he made as if to roll over, and he stretched his paws and acted sure queer. Ed said, "That bar's crippled. He's been shot by one of the boys, and he's trying to get up." But I sure didn't exactly agree with Ed, so I was for watching him some more. He looked like a sick bar, raising his head so slow and dropping it so slow and sort of twisting his body. It looked like his back had been broke and he was trying to get up, but somehow I couldn't believe that. Then he lay still, and Ed swore he was dead. Sure, I got almost to believing that myself, when he waked up, and then the old scoundrel slid around lazy like a torn cat by the fire and sort of rolled on his back and stretched. Next he slapped at himself with his paws. If he wasn't sick, he was sure acting queer with that canyon full of crackling guns and baying hounds and yelling men. I begun to get suspicious. Sure, he must be a dying bear. So I said to Ed, "Let's bast him a couple just for luck." Well, when we shot, up jumped that sick bar quicker'n you could wink. As he piled into the thicket while I was going down after another shell, it sure was funny. That old Jasper never heard the racket, and if he heard it, he didn't care. He had a bed in that sunny spot, and he was fooling around, playing with himself like a kitten. Playin'! And Ed reckoned he was dying, and I come sure near being fooled. That old Jasper, we'll assassinate him for that. End of Chapter 4, Part 8. Chapter 4 of Tales of Lonely Trails by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4, Tonto Basin, Part 9. 5 more long, arduous days we put in chasing bears under the rim from Piles Canyon to Verde Canyon. In all, we started over a dozen bears, but I was inclined to think that we chased the same bears over and over from one canyon to another. The boys got a good many long-range shots, which, however, apparently did no damage. But as for me, the harder and farther I tramped, and the longer I watched and waited, the less opportunity had I to shoot a bear. This circumstance weighed heavily upon the spirits of my comrades. They wore their boots out, as well as the feet of the hounds, trying to chase a bear somewhere near me. And wherever I stayed or went, there was the place the bears avoided. Ed and Nielsen lost flesh in this daily toil. Haut had gloomy moments, but as for me, the daily 10 or 15-mile grind up and down the steep, craggy slopes had at last trained me back to my former vigorous condition, and I was happy. No one knew it, not even R.C., but the fact was I really did not care in the least whether I shot a bear or not. Bears were incidental to my hunting trip. I had not a little secret glee over the praise accorded me by Copple and Haut and Nielsen, who all thought that the way I persevered was remarkable. They would have broken their necks to get me a bear. At times R.C., when he was tired, fell victim to discouragement, and he would make some caustic remark. "I don't know about you. I've a hunch you like to pack a rifle 'cause it's heavy, and you go dreaming along. Sometime a bear will rise up and swipe you one." Takahashi passed from concern to grief over what he considered my bad luck. "My goodness! No see bear today. Maybe more better luck tomorrow." If I could have had some of Takahashi's luck, I would scarcely have needed to leave camp. He borrowed Nielsen's .30-40 rifle and went hunting without ever having shot it. He rode the little buckskin mustang that, remarkable to state, had not yet thrown him or kicked him. And on that occasion he led the mustang back to camp with a fine 2-point buck on the saddle. "Camp need fresh meat," said the Jap, with his broad smile. "I go hunt. Right along old road. Soon nice fat deer walk out from bush. 20 steps away, maybe. I get off. I no want kill deer so close, so I walk on him. Deer he no scared. He jump off few steps. Stick up his ears. Look at horse all same like he thought him deer too. I no aim gun from shoulder. I just shoot. No good. Deer he run. I aim then, way front of him. Shoot. Deer he drop right down dead. Ah, easy to get deer." I would have given a great deal to have been able to describe Haught's face when the Jap finished his story of killing that deer. But such feat was beyond human ingenuity. "Wal," ejaculated the hunter, "in my days rastlin' round with fools packin' guns, I never seen the likes of that. No wonder the Japs licked the Russians." This achievement of Takahashi's led me to suggest his hunting bear with us. "Ah, sure, I kill bear, too," he said. Takahashi outwalked and outclimbed us all. He never made detours. He climbed straight up or descended straight down. Copple and Ed were compelled to see him take the lead and keep it. What a wonderful climber! What a picture the sturdy little brown man made, carrying a rifle longer than himself, agile and sure-footed as a goat, perfectly at home in the depths or on the heights. I took occasion to ask Takahashi if he had been used to mountain climbing in Japan. "Ah, sure. I have father own whole mountain more bigger here. I climb high, saw wood. Leetle boy so big." And he held his hand about a foot from the ground. Thus for me every day brought out some further interesting or humorous or remarkable feature pertaining to Takahashi. The next day added to the discouragement of my party. We drove Verde Canyon and ran the dogs into a nest of steel traps. Bigfoot was caught in one, and only the remarkable size and strength of his leg saved it from being broken. Nielsen found a poor miserable little fox in a trap where it had been for days and was nearly dead. Ed found a dead skunk in another. He had to call the hounds in. We returned to camp. That night was really the only cheerless one the men spent around the fire. They did not know what to do. Manifestly, with trappers in a locality, there could be no more bear chasing. Disappointment perched upon the countenance of the Haught's and Copple and Nielsen. I let them all have their say. Finally Haught spoke up. "Wal, fellers, I'm figuring hard, and reckon here's my stand. We just naturally have to get Doc and his brother a bear apiece. Sure, I expected we'd get 'em a couple. Now, them traps we seen are all small. We didn't run across no bear traps, and I reckon we can risk the dogs. We'll sure go back and drive Verde Canyon. We can't do no worse than break a leg for a dog. I'd hate to see that happen to old Dan or Tom, but we'll take a chance." After that there fell a moment's silence. I could see from Ed's face what a serious predicament this was. Nothing was plainer than his fondness for the hounds. Finally he said, "Sure, we'll take a chance." Their devotion to my interest, their simple earnestness, warmed me to them. But not for all the bears under the rim would I have been wittingly to blame for old Dan or old Tom breaking a leg. "Men, I've got a better idea," I said. "We'll let the bears here rest for a spell. Supplies are about gone. Let's go back to Beaver Dam Camp for a week or so. Rest up the hounds. Maybe we'll have a storm and a cold snap that will improve conditions. Then we'll come back here. I'll send Haught down to pay off the trappers. I'll pay them to spring their traps and let us have our hunt without risk of the hounds." Instantly the men brightened. The insurmountable obstacles seemed to melt away. Only Haught demurred a little at additional and unreasonable expense for me. But I cheered him over this hindrance, and the last part of that evening round the campfire was very pleasant. The following morning we broke camp and all rode off, except Haught and his son George, who remained to hunt a strayed burro. "Reckon that lion eat him. My best burro. He was the one your boy was always playin' with. I'm goin' to assassinate that lion." On the way back to Beaver Dam Camp I happened to be near Takahashi when he dismounted to shoot at a squirrel. Returning to get back in the saddle, the Jap forgot to approach the mustang from the proper side. There was a scuffle between Takahashi and the mustang as to which of them should possess the bridle. The Jap lost this argument. Ed had to repair the broken bridle. I watched Takahashi, and could see that he did not like the mustang any better than the mustang liked him. Soon the struggle for supremacy would take place between this ill-sorted rider and horse. I rather felt inclined to favor the latter. Nevertheless, it was only fair to Takahashi to admit that his buckskin-colored mustang had some mean traits. In due time I arrived at our permanent camp, to be the last to get in. Lee and his father welcomed us as familiar faces in a strange land. As I dismounted I heard heavy thuds and cracks accompanied by fierce utterances in a foreign tongue. These sounds issued from the corral. "I'll bet the Jap got what was comin' to him," declared Lee. We all ran toward the corral. A bunch of horses obstructed our view, and we could not see Takahashi until we ran round to the other side. The Jap had the buckskin mustang up in a corner and was vigorously whacking him with a huge pole. Not by any means was the mustang docile. Like a mule he kicked. "Hey, George!" yelled Lee. "Don't kill him! What's the matter?" Takahashi slammed the mustang one parting blow, which broke the club, and then he turned to us. We could see from dust and dirt on his person that he had lately been in close relation to the earth. Takahashi's face was pale, except for a great red lump on his jaw. The Jap was terribly angry. He seemed hurt, too. With a shaking hand he pointed to the bruise on his jaw. "Look what he do!" exclaimed Takahashi. "He throw me off. He kick me awful hard. I kill him sure next time." Lee and I managed to conceal our mirth until our irate cook had gotten out of hearing. "Look what he do!" choked Lee, imitating Takahashi. Then Lee broke out and roared. I had to join him. I laughed till I cried. My family and friends severely criticized this primitive trait of mine, but I cannot help it. Later I went to Takahashi and asked to examine his jaw, fearing it might have been broken. This fear of mine, however, was unfounded. Moreover, the Jap had recovered from his pain and anger. "More better now," he said with a grin. "Maybe my fault anyhow." Next day we rested, and the following morning was so fine and clear and frosty that we decided to go hunting. We rode east on the way to Sea Lake through beautiful deep forest. I saw a deer trotting away into the woods. I jumped off, jerked out my gun, and ran hard, hoping to see him in an opening. Lo! I jumped a herd of 6 more deer, some of them bucks. They plunged everywhere. I tried frantically to get my sights on one. All I could aim at was bobbing ears. I shot twice, and of course missed. R.C. shot 4 times, once at a running buck, and 3 at a small deer that he said was flying. Here Copple and Haught caught up with us. We went on and turned off the road on the Blaze Trail to Sea Lake. It was pretty open forest, oaks and scattered pines, and a few spruce. The first park we came to was a flat, grassy open, with places where deer licked the bare earth. Copple left several pounds of salt in these spots. R.C. and I went up to the upper end, where he had seen deer before. No deer this day, but saw 3 turkeys, one an old gobbler. We lost sight of them. Then Copple and R.C. went one way and Haught and I another. We went clear to the rim, and then circled around and eventually met R.C. and Copple. Together we started to return. Going down a little draw we found water, and R.C. saw where a rock had been splashed with water and was still wet. Then I saw a turkey track upon this rock. We slipped up the slope with me in the lead. As I came out on top, I saw 5 big gobblers feeding. Strange how these game birds thrilled me. One saw me and started to run. Like a streak! Another edged away into pines. Then I espied one with his head and neck behind a tree, and he was scratching away in the pine needles. I could not see much of him, but that little was not running, so I drew down upon him, tried to aim fine, and fired. He leaped up with a roar of wings, sending the dust and needles flying. Then he dropped back, and like a flash darted into a thicket. Another flew straight out of the glade. Another ran like an ostrich in the same direction. I tried to get the sights on him. In vain. R.C. and Copple chased these 2 speeding turkeys, and Haught and I went the other way. We could find no trace of ours, and we returned to our horses. Presently we heard shots. 1, 2, 3. Pause. Then several more. And finally more, to a total number of 15. I could not stand that, and I had to hurry back into the woods. I saw one old gobbler running wildly around as if lost, but I did not shoot at him because he seemed to be in line with the direction which R.C. and Copple had taken. I should have run after him until he went some other way. I could not find the hunters, and returned to our resting place, which they had reached ahead of me. They had a turkey each, gobblers about 2 years old, Copple said. R.C. told an interesting story of how he had run in the direction the 2 turkeys had taken, and suddenly flushed 30 or 40 more, some big old gobblers, but mostly young. They scattered and ran. He followed as fast as he could, shooting a few times. Copple could not keep up with him, but evidently had a few shots himself. R.C. chased most of the flock across several small canyons till he came to a deep canyon. Here he hoped to make a killing when the turkeys ran up the far slope, but they flew across, and he heard them clucking over there. He crossed and went on cautiously. Once he saw 3 turkey heads sticking above a log. Wise old gobblers, they protected their bodies while they watched for him. He tried to get sideways to them, but they ran off. Then he followed until once more he heard clucking. Here he sat down, just beyond the edge of a canyon, and began to call with his turkey wing. It thrilled him to hear his calls answered on all sides. Here was a wonderful opportunity. He realized that the turkeys were mostly young and scattered and frightened, and wanted to come together. He kept calling, and as they neared him on all sides, he felt something more than the zest of hunting. Suddenly Copple began to shoot. Spang, spang, spang! R.C. saw the dust fly under one turkey. He heard the bullet glance. The next shot killed a turkey. Then R.C. yelled that he was no turkey. Then out of that scattering flock he managed to knock over one for himself. Copple had been deceived by the call of an amateur. That flattered R.C., but he was keenly disappointed that Copple had spoiled the situation. During the day the blue sky was covered by thin flying clouds that gradually thickened and darkened. The wind grew keener and colder, and veered to the southwest. We all said storm. There was no sunset. Darker clouds rolled up, obliterating the few stars. We went to bed. Long after that I heard the swell and roar and crash and lull of the wind in the pines, a sound I had learned to love in Buckskin Forest with Buffalo Jones. At last I fell asleep. Sometime in the night I awoke. A fine rain was pattering on the tent. It grew stronger. After a while I went to sleep again. Upon awakening I found that the storm had struck with a vengeance. It was dull gray daylight, foggy, cold, windy, with rain and snow. I got up, built a fire, puttered around the tents to loosen the ground ropes, and found that it was nipping cold. My fingers ached. The storm increased, and then we fully appreciated the tent with stove. The rain roared on the tent roof, and all morning the wind increased, and the air grew colder. I hoped it would turn to snow. Soon indeed we were storm-bound. On the third day the wind reached a very high velocity. The roar in the pines was stupendous. Many times I heard the dull crash of a falling tree. With the ground saturated by the copious rain and the fury of the storm blast, a great many trees were felled. That night it rained all night, not so hard, but steadily, now low, now vigorously. After morning snow began to fall, but it did not lay long. After a while it changed to sleet. At times the dark, lowering, scurrying clouds broke, to emit a flare of sunshine and to show a patch of blue. These last, however, were soon obscured by the scudding gray pall. Every now and then a little shower of rain or sleet pattered on the tents. We looked for a clearing up. That night, about 8 o'clock, the clouds vanished and stars shone. In the night the wind rose and roared. In the morning all was dark, cloudy, raw, cold. But the wind had died out, and there were spots of blue showing. These spots enlarged as the morning advanced, and about 9 the sun, golden and dazzling, beautified the forest. Bright sunny days will soon come again. It was good to have hope and belief in that. All the horses but Don Carlos weathered the storm in good shape. Don lost considerable weight. He had never before been left with hobbled feet to shift for himself in a prolonged storm of rain, sleet, and snow. He had cut himself upon brush, and altogether had fared poorly. He showed plainly that he had been neglected. Don was the only horse I had ever known of that did not welcome the wilderness and companionship with his kind. We rested the following day, and on the next we packed and started back to Dude Creek. It was a cold, raw, bitter day, with a gale from the north, such a day as I could never have endured had I not become hardened. As it was, I almost enjoyed wind and cold. What a transformation in the woods! The little lakes were all frozen over. Pines, moss, grass were white with frost. The sere days had come. Not a leaf showed in the aspen and maple thickets. The scrub oaks were shaggy and ragged, gray as the rocks. From the rim the slopes looked steely and dark, thinned out, showing the rocks and slides. When we reached our old camp in Barber Shop Canyon, we were all glad to see Haught's lost burro waiting for us there. Not a scratch showed on the shaggy, lop-eared little beast. Haught for once unhobbled a burro and set it free without a parting kick. Nielsen, too, had observed this omission on Haught's part. Nielsen was a desert man, and he knew burros. He said prospectors were inclined to show affection for burros by sundry cuffs and kicks. And Nielsen told me a story about Haught. It seemed the bear hunter was noted for that habit of kicking burros. Sometimes he was in fun, and sometimes, when burros were obstinate, he was in earnest. Upon one occasion a big burro strayed away from camp quite a long time, long enough to incur Haught's displeasure. He needed the burro and could not find it, and all he could do was to hunt for it. Upon returning to camp, there stood the big gray burro, lazy and fat, just as if he had been perfectly well behaved. Haught put a halter on the burro, using strong language the while, and then he proceeded to exercise his habit of kicking burros. He kicked this one until its fat belly gave forth sounds exceedingly like a bass drum. When Haught had ended his exercise he tied up the burro. Presently a man came running into Haught's camp. He appeared alarmed. He was wet and panting. Haught recognized him as a miner from a mine near by. "Hey, Haught," panted the miner, "have you seen your gray burro, that big one with white face?" "Sure, there he is," replied Haught. "Son of a gun, just rustled home." The miner appeared immensely relieved. He looked and looked at the gray burro as if to make sure it was there in the solid flesh, a really tangible object. And then he said, "We was all afeard you'd kick the stuffin' out of him. Not an hour ago he was over at the mine, and he ate 5 sticks of dynamite. 5 sticks! For Lord's sake, handle him gently." Haught turned pale and suddenly sat down. "Ah!" was all he said, but he had a strange, haunted look, and not for a long time did he ever again kick a burro. Hunting conditions at Dude Creek had changed greatly to our benefit. The trappers had pulled up stakes and gone to some other section of the country. There was not a hunting party within 15 miles of our camp. Leaves and acorns were all down. Trails were soft and easy to travel. No dust rose on the southern slopes. The days were cold and bright. In every pocket and ravine there was water for the dogs. From any stand we could see into the shaggy thickets, where before all we could see was a blaze of color. In 3 days we drove Pyle's Canyon, Dude Creek, and the small adjoining canyons, chasing in all 9 bears, none of which ran anywhere near R.C. or me. Old Dan gave out and had to rest every other day, so the gloom again began to settle thick over the hopes of my faithful friends. Long since, as in 1918, I had given up expectations of bagging a bear or a buck. For R.C., however, my hopes still held good. At least I did not give up for him. But he shared somewhat the feelings of the men. Still he worked harder than ever, abandoning the idea of waiting on one of the high stands, and took to the slopes under the rim, where he toiled down and up all day long. It pleased me to learn presently that this activity, strenuous as it was, became a source of delight to him. How different such toil was from waiting and watching on the rim! On November 1st, a bitter cold morning, with ice in the bright air, we went back to Pyle's Canyon, and 4 of us went down with Ed and the hounds. We had several chases, and about the middle of the forenoon I found myself alone, making tracks for the saddle overlooking Bear Canyon. Along the south side of the slope, in the still air, the sun was warm, but when I got up into the saddle, in an exposed place, the wind soon chilled me through. I would keep my stand until I nearly froze, then I had to go around to the sunny, sheltered side and warm up. The hounds finally got within hearing again, and eventually appeared to be in Bear Canyon toward the mouth. I decided I ought to go round the rim on the east side and see if I could hear better. Accordingly I set off, and the hard going over the sunny slope was just what I needed. When I reached the end of the ridge under the great dome, I heard the hounds below me, somewhat to my left. Running and plowing down through the brush, I gained the edge of the bluff just in time to see some of the hounds passing on. They had run a bear through that thicket, and if I had been there sooner I would have been fortunate. But too late. I worked around the head of this canyon and across a wide promontory. Again I heard the hounds right under me. They came nearer, and soon I heard rolling rocks and crackling brush, which sounds I believe were made by a bear. After a while I espied Old Tom and Rock working up the canyon on a trail. Then I was sure I would get a shot. Presently, however, Old Tom left the trail and started back. Rock came on, climbed the ridge, and hearing me call, he came to me. I went over to the place where he had climbed out, and found an enormous bear track pointing in the direction the hounds had come. They had back-trailed him. Rock went back to join Old Tom. Some of the pack were baying at a great rate in the mouth of the next canyon, but an impassable cliff prevented me from working around to that point. So I had to address myself to the long, steep climb upward. I had not gone far when I crossed the huge bear track that Rock and Old Tom had given up. This track was 6 inches wide and 10 inches long. The bear that had made it had come down this very morning from over the ridge east of Bear Canyon. I trailed him up this ridge, over the steepest and roughest and wildest part of it, marveling at the enormous steps and jumps he made, and at the sagacity which caused him to choose this route instead of the saddle trail where I had waited so long. His track led up nearly to the rim, and proved how he had climbed over the most rugged break in the ridge. Indeed, he was one of the wise old scoundrels. When I reached camp I learned that Sue and several more of the hounds had held a bear for some time in the box of the canyon just beyond where I had to give up. Ed and Nielsen were across this canyon, unable to go farther, and then yelled themselves hoarse trying to call some of us. I asked Ed if he saw the bear. "Sure did," replied Ed. "One of them long, lean, hungry cinnamons." I had to laugh, and told how near I had come to meeting a bear that was short, fat, and heavy. One of the old Jasper scoundrels. That night at dark the wind still blew a gale, and seemed more bitterly cold. We hugged the campfire. My eyes smarted from the smoke, and my face grew black. Before I went to bed I toasted myself so thoroughly that my clothes actually burned me as I lay down. But they heated the blankets, and that made my bed snug, and soon I was in the land of dreams. During the night I awoke. The wind had lulled. The canopy above was clear, cold, starry, beautiful. When we rolled out, the mercury showed 10 above zero. Perhaps looking at the thermometer made us feel colder, but in any event we would have had to move about to keep warm. I built a fire, and my hands were blocks of ice when I got the blaze stirring. That day, so keen and bright, so wonderful with its clarity of atmosphere and the breath of winter through the pines, promised to be as exciting as it was beautiful. Maybe this day R.C. would bag a bear. When we reached the rim, the sunrise was just flushing the purple basin, flooding with exquisite gold and rose light the slumberous shadows. What a glorious wilderness to greet the eye at sunrise! I suffered a pang to realize what men missed, what I had to miss so many wonderful mornings. We had made our plans. The hounds had left a bear in the second canyon east of Dude. Ed started down. Copple and Takahashi followed to hug the lower slopes. Nielsen and Haught and George held to the rim to ride east in case the hounds chased a bear that way, and R.C. and I were to try to climb out and down a thin rock-crested ridge which, so far as Haught knew, no one had ever been on. Looked at from above, this ridge was indeed a beautiful and rugged backbone of rock. Sloping from the rim, extending far out and down, a very narrow, knife-edge extended promontory, green with cedar and pine, yellow and gray with its crags and rocks. A craggy point comparable to some of those in the Grand Canyon. We had to study a way to get across the first deep fissures, and eventually descended far under the crest and climbed back. It was desperately hard work, for we had so little time. R.C. was to be at the middle of that ridge, and I at the end in an hour. Like Trojans we worked. Some slippery pine needle slopes we had to run across, for light, quick steps were the only means of safe travel. And that was not safe. When we surmounted to the crest we found a jumble of weathered rocks ready to slide down on either side. Slabs, pyramids, columns, shale, rocks of all shapes except round, lay toppling along the heaved ridge. It seemed the whole ridge was ready to thunder down into the abyss. Half a mile down and out from the rim we felt lost, marooned. But there was something splendidly thrilling in our conquest of that narrow, upflung edge of mountain. Twice R.C. thought we would have to abandon further progress, but I found ways to go on. How lonely and wild out there! No foot save an Indian's had ever trod those gray rocks or brown mats of pine needles. Before we reached the dip or saddle where R.C. was to make his stand, the hounds opened up far below. The morning was perfectly still, an unusual occurrence there along the rim. What wild music! Then Ed's horn pealed out, ringing melody, a long blast, keen and clear, telling us above that he had started a bear. That made us hurry. We arrived at the head of an incline leading down to R.C.'s stand. As luck would have it, the place was ideal for a bear, but risky for a hunter. A bear could come 4 ways without being seen until he was close enough to kill a man. We hurried on. At the saddle there was a broad bear trail with several other trails leading into it. Suddenly R.C. halted me with a warning finger. "Listen!" I heard a faint, clear rifle shot, then another and a fainter yell. We stood there and counted 11 more shots. Then the bay of the hounds seemed to grow closer. We had little time to pick and choose stands. I had yet to reach the end of the ridge, a task requiring 7-league boots. But I took time to choose the best possible stand for R.C., and that was one where a bear approaching from only the east along under the ridge could surprise him. In bad places like this we always tried to have our minds made up what to do and where to get in case of being charged by a wounded grizzly. In this instance there was not a rock or a tree near at hand. "R.C., you'll have to stand your ground and kill him, that's all," I declared grimly. "But it's quiet. You can hear a bear coming. If you hear one, wait and make sure your first shot lets him down." "Don't worry. I could hear a squirrel coming over this ground," replied R.C. Then I went on, not exactly at ease in mind, but stirred and thrilled to the keen, charged atmosphere. I had to go around under the base of a rocky ledge, over rough ground. Presently I dropped into a bear trail, well trodden. I followed it to a corner of cliff where it went down. Then I kept on over loose rock and bare earth, washed deep in ruts. I had to leap these. Perhaps in 10 minutes I had traveled a quarter of a mile, or less. Then spang! R.C.'s rifle shot halted me. So clear and sharp, so close, so startling. I was thrilled, delighted. He had gotten a shot. I wanted to yell my pleasure. My blood warmed and my nerves tingled. Swiftly my thoughts ran. Bad luck was nothing. A man had only to stick at a thing. What a fine, sharp, wonderful day for adventure! How the hounds bayed! Had R.C. sighted a bear somewhere below? Suddenly the still air split. Spang! R.C.'s second shot gave me a shock. My breast contracted. I started back. "Suppose it was a grizzly on that bad side," I muttered. Spang! I began to run. A great sweeping wave of emotion charged over me, swelling all my veins to the bursting point. Spang! My heart came to my throat. Leaping the ruts, bounding like a sheep from rock to rock, I covered my back tracks. All inside me seemed to flutter, yet I felt cold and hard, a sickening sense of reproach that I had left my brother in a bad position. Spang! His 5th and last shot followed swiftly after the 4th, too swift to be accurate. So hurriedly a man would act in close quarters. R.C. now had an empty rifle. Like a flash I crossed that slope leading to the rocks, and tore around the cliff at such speed that it was a wonder I did not pitch down and break my neck. How long, how terribly long, I seemed in reaching the corner of a cliff. Then I plunged to a halt, with eyes darting everywhere. R.C. was not in sight. The steep, curved neck of slope seemed all rocks, all trees, all brush. Then I heard a wild, hoarse bawl and a loud crashing of brush. My gaze swerved to an open spot. A patch of manzanita seemed to blur round a big bear, standing up, fighting the branches, threshing and growling. But where was R.C.? Fearfully my gaze peered near and all around this wounded bear. "Hey, there!" I yelled with all my might. R.C.'s answer was another spang. I heard the bullet hit the bear. It must have gone clear through him, for I saw bits of fur and manzanita fly. The bear plunged out of the bushes, out of my sight. How he crashed the brush, rolled the rocks! I listened. Down and down he crashed. Then the sound changed somewhat. He was rolling. At last that thumping sound ceased, and after it the roll of rocks. "Are you all right?" I shouted. Then, after a moment that made me breathless, I heard R.C. laugh a little shakily. "Sure am. Did you see him?" "Yes, I think he's your bear." "I'm afraid he's got away. The hounds took another bear down the canyon. What'll we do?" "Come on down," I said. 50 yards or more down the slope we met. I showed him a great splotch of blood on a flat stone. "We'll find him not far down," I said. So we slid and crawled and held to brush and rocks, following that bloody trail until we came to a ledge. From there I espied the bear lodged against a manzanita bush. He lay on his back, all 4 paws extended, and he was motionless. R.C. and I sat right there on the ledge. "Looks pretty big, black and brown, mostly brown," I said. "I'm glad, old man, you stuck it out." "Big!" exclaimed R.C. with that same peculiar little laugh. "He doesn't look big now, but up there he looked like a hill. What do you think? He came up that very way you told me to look out for, and if I hadn't had ears he'd got right on me. As it was, when I heard little rolling stones and then saw him, he was almost on a level with me. My nerve was all right. I knew I had him, and I made sure of my first shot. I knocked him flat, but he got up, let out an awful snarl, and plunged my way. I can't say I know he charged me, only it was just the same as if he had. I knocked him down again, and this time he began to kick and jump down the slope. That was my best shot. Think I missed him the next 3. You see, I had time to get shaky. If he had kept coming at me, good night. I had trouble loading. But when I got ready again, I ran down and saw him in that bush. Wasn't far from him then. When he let out that bawl, he saw me. I don't know much about bears, but I know he wanted to get at me, and I'm sure of what he'd have done. I didn't miss my last shot." We sat there a while longer, slowly calming down. Wonderful indeed had been some of the moments of thrill, but there had been others not conducive to happiness. Why do men yearn for adventure in wild moments and regret the risks and spilled blood afterward? Chapter 4 of Tales of Lonely Trails by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4, Tonto Basin, Part 10. The hounds enjoyed a well-earned rest the next day. R.C. and I, behind Haught's back, fed them all they could eat. The old hunter had a fixed idea that dogs should be kept lean and hungry, so that they would run bears the better. Perhaps he was right, only I could not withstand Old Dan and Old Tom as they limped to me begging and whining. Yet not even sore feet and hunger could rob these grand old hounds of their dignity. For an hour that morning I sat beside them in a sunny spot. In the afternoon Copple took me on a last deer hunt for that trip. We rode down the canyon a mile and climbed out on the west slope. Haught had described this country as a wolf to travel. He used that word to designate anything particularly tough. We found the ridge covered with a dense forest, in places a matted jungle of pine saplings. These thickets were impenetrable. Heavy snows had bent the pines so that they grew at an angle. We found it necessary to skirt these thickets, and at that sometimes had to cut our way through with our little axes. Hunting was scarcely possible under such conditions. Still, we did not see any deer tracks. Eventually we crossed this ridge, or at least the jungle part of it, and got lower down into hollows and swales full of aspens. Copple recognized country he had hunted before. We made our way up a long shallow hollow that ended in an open where lay the remains of an old log cabin and corrals. From under a bluff bubbled a clear, beautiful spring. Copple looked all around slowly, with strange expression, and at last, dismounting, he knelt to drink of the spring. "Ah, good!" he exclaimed after a deep draught. "Get down and drink. Snow water, and it never goes dry." Indeed, it was so cold it made my teeth ache, and so pure and sweet that I drank until I could hold no more. Deer and cat and bear tracks showed along the margin of clean sand. Lower down were fresh turkey tracks. A lonely spring in the woods visited by wild game. This place was singularly picturesque and beautiful. The purest drinking water is found in wild forest or on mountains. Men, cities, civilization contaminate waters that are not isolated. Copple told me a man named Mitchell had lived in that lonely place 30 years ago. Copple, as a boy, had worked for him, had ridden wild broncos and roped wild steers in that open, many and many a day. Something of unconscious pathos showed in Copple's eyes as he gazed around, and in his voice. We all hear the echoing footsteps of the past years. In those days, Copple said the ranch was overrun by wild game, and wild horses, too. We rode on westward to come out at length on the rim of a magnificent canyon. It was the widest and deepest and wildest gorge I had come across in this country, so deep that only a faint roar of running water reached our ears. The slopes were too steep for man, let alone a horse, and the huge cliffs and giant spruces gave it a singularly rugged appearance. We saw deer on the opposite slope. Copple led along the edge, searching for traces of an old trail where Mitchell used to drive cattle across. We did not find a trail, but we found a place where Copple said one used to be. I could see no signs of it. Here, leading his horse with one hand and wielding his little axe with the other, Copple started down. For my part, I found going down remarkably easy. The only trouble I had was to hold on so I would not go down like a flash. Stockings, my horse, had in a few weeks become a splendid traveler in the forest. He had learned to restrain his spirit and use his intelligence. Wherever I led he would go, and that without any fear. There is something fine in constant association with an intelligent horse under such circumstances. In bad places Stockings braced his forefeet, sat on his haunches, and slid, sometimes making me jump to get out of his way. We found the canyon bed a narrow notch, darkly rich and green, full of the melody of wild birds and murmuring brook, with huge rocks all stained gold and russet, and grass as high as our knees. Frost still lingered in the dark, cool, shady retreat, and where the sun struck a narrow strip of the gorge there was warm, sweet, dry breath of the forest. But for the most part down here all was damp, dank, cool shadow, where sunshine never reached, and where the smells were of dead leaves and wet moss and ferns and black, rich earth. Impossible, we found it, to ascend the other slope where we had seen the deer, so we had to ride up the canyon, a matter greatly to my liking. Copple thought I was hunting with him, but really, except to follow him, I did not think of the meaning of his slow, wary advance. Only a few more days had I to roam the pine-scented forest. That ride up this deep gorge was rich in sensation. Sun and sky and breeze and forest encompassed me. The wilderness was all about me. And I regretted when the canyon lost its splendid ruggedness and became like the others I had traversed, and at last grew to be a shallow, grassy ravine with patches of gray aspens along the tiny brook. As we climbed out once more, this time into an open, beautiful pine forest with little patches of green thicket, I seemed to have been drugged by the fragrance and color and the beauty of the wild, for when Copple called low and sharp, "Hist!" I stared uncomprehendingly at him. "Deer!" he whispered, pointing. "Get off and smoke 'em up." Something shot through me, a different kind of thrill. Ahead in the open I saw gray, graceful, wild forms trotting away. Like a flash I slid off my horse and jerked out my rifle. I ran forward a few steps. The deer had halted, were gazing at us with heads up and ears high. What a wild, beautiful picture! As I raised my rifle they seemed to move and vanish in the green. The hunter in me, roused at last, anathematized my miserable luck. I ran ahead another few steps, to be halted by Copple. "Buck!" he called sharply. "Hurry!" Then further on in the open, out in the sunlight, I saw a noble stag moving, trotting towards us. Keen, hard, fierce in my intensity, I aligned the sights upon his breast and fired. Straight forward and high he bounded, to fall with a heavy thud. Copple's horse, startled by my shot, began to snort and plunge. "Good shot!" yelled Copple. "He's our meat!" What possessed me I know not, but I ran ahead of Copple. My eyes searched avidly the bush-dotted ground for my quarry. The rifle felt hot in my tight grip. All inside me was a tumult, eager, keen, wild excitement. The great pines, the green aisles leading away into the woods, the shadows under the thickets, the pine-pitch tang of the air, the loneliness of that lonely forest, all these seemed familiar, sweet, beautiful things, mine alone, things seen and smelled and felt before, things... Then suddenly I ran right upon my deer, lying motionless, dead, I thought. He appeared fairly large, with 3-point antlers. I heard Copple's horse thudding the soft earth behind me, and I yelled, "I got him, Ben!" That was a moment of exultation. It ended suddenly. Something halted me. My buck, now scarcely 15 feet from me, began to shake and struggle. He raised his head, uttering a choking gasp. I heard the flutter of blood in his throat. He raised himself on his front feet and lifted his head higher, higher, until his nose pointed skyward and his antlers lay back upon his shoulders. Then a strong convulsion shook him. I heard the shuddering wrestle of his whole body. I heard the gurgle and flow of blood, saw the smoke of fresh blood and smelled it. I saw a small red spot in his gray breast where my bullet had struck. I saw a great bloody gaping hole on his rump where the .30 Government expanding bullet had come out. From end to end that bullet had torn, and yet he was not dead, straining to rise again. I saw, felt all this in one flashing instant, and as swiftly my spirit changed. What I might have done I never knew, but most likely I would have shot him through the brain. Only a sudden action of the stag paralyzed all my force. He lowered his head. He saw me, and dying, with lungs and heart and bowels shot to shreds, he edged his stiff front feet towards me. He dragged his afterquarters. He slid. He flopped. He skittered convulsively at me. No fear in the black, distended, wild eyes. Only hate, only terrible, wild, unquenchable spirit to live long enough to kill me. I saw it. He meant to kill me. How magnificent, how horrible, this wild courage! My eyes seemed riveted upon him as he came closer, closer. He gasped. Blood sputtered from his throat. But more terrible than agony, than imminent death, was the spirit of this wild beast to slay its enemy. Inch by inch he skidded closer to me, with a convulsive quivering, awful to see. No veil of the past, no scale of civilization between beast and man then. Enemies as old as the earth. I had shot him to eat, and he would kill me before he died. For me the moment was monstrous. No hunter was I then, but a man stricken by the spirit and mystery of life, by the agony and terror of death, by the awful strange sense that this stag would kill me. But Copple galloped up, and drawing his revolver he shot the deer through the head. It fell in a heap. "Don't ever go close to a crippled deer," admonished my comrade as he leaped off his horse. "I saw a fellow once that was near killed by a buck he'd taken for dead. Strange the way this buck half stood up. Reckon he meant bad, but he was all in. You hit him plumb center." "Yes, Ben, it was strange," I replied soberly. I caught Copple's keen, dark glance studying me. "When you open him up, see what my bullet did, will you?" "All right, help me hang him to a snag here," returned Copple, as he untied his lasso. When we got the deer strung up, I went off into the woods and sat on a log, and contended with a queer sort of sickness until it passed away. But it left a state of mind that I knew would require me to probe into myself, and try to understand once and for all time this bloodthirsty tendency of man to kill. It would force me to try to analyze the psychology of hunting. Upon my return to Copple, I found he had the buck ready to load upon his horse. His hands were bright red. He was wiping his hunting knife on a bunch of green pine needles. "That 150-grain soft-nosed bullet is some executioner," he declared forcefully. "Your bullet mushroomed just after it went into his breast. It tore his lung to pieces, cut open his heart, made a mess of kidneys and paunch, and broke his spine. And look at this hole where it came out." I helped Copple heave the load on his saddle and tie it securely, and I got my hands red in the job. But I did not really look at the buck again. And upon our way back to camp I rode in the lead all the way. We reached camp before sunset, where I had to endure the felicitations of R.C. and my comrades, all of whom were delighted that at last I had gotten a buck. Takahashi smiled all over his broad brown face. "My goodnish, I awful glad. Nice fat deer." That night I lay awake a long time, and though aware of the moan of the wind in the pines and the tinkle of the brook and the melancholy hoot of an owl, and later the still, sad, black silence of the midnight hours, I really had no pleasure in them. My mind was active. Boys are inherently cruel. The games they play, at least those they invent, instinctively partake of some element of brute nature. They chase, they capture, they imprison, they torture, and they kill. No secret rendezvous of a boy's pirate gang ever failed to be soaked with imaginary blood. And what group of boys have not played at being pirates? The Indian games are worse, scalping with red-hot cinders thrown upon the bleeding head, and the terrible running of the gauntlet, and the burning at the stake. What youngster has not made wooden knives to spill the blood of his pretended enemies? Little girls play with dolls, and with toy houses, and all the implements of making a home. But sweet and dear as the little angels are, they love a boy's game, and if they can, through some lucky accident, participate in one, it is to scream and shudder and fight, indeed, like the female of the species. No break here between these little mothers of doll babies and the bloody mothers of the French Revolution, or of dusky, naked, barbarian children of a primitive day. Boys love the chase, and that chase depends upon environment. For want of wild game, they will harry a poor miserable tomcat with sticks and stones. I belonged once to a gang of young ruffians who chased the neighbors' chickens, killed them with clubs, and cooked them in tin cans over a hidden fire. Boys love nothing so much as to chase a squirrel or a frightened little chipmunk back and forth along a rail fence. They brandish their sticks, run and yell, dart to and fro like young Indians. They rob birds' nests, steal the eggs, pierce them, and blow them. They capture the young birds, and are not above killing the parents that fly frantically to the rescue. I knew of boys who ground captured birds to death on a grindstone. Who has not seen a boy fling stones at a helpless hop toad? As boys grow older to the age of reading, they select, or at least love best, those stories of bloodshed and violence. Stevenson wrote that boys read for some element of the brute instinct in them. His two wonderful books, Treasure Island and Kidnapped, are full of fight and the killing of men. Robinson Crusoe is the only great boys' book I ever read that did not owe its charm to fighting. But still did not old Crusoe fight to live on his lonely island? And this wonderful tale is full of hunting, and has at the end the battle with cannibals. When lads grow up, they become hunters almost without exception, at least in spirit if not in deed. Early days and environment decide whether or not a man becomes a hunter. In all my life I have met only 2 grown men who did not care to go prowling and hunting in the woods with a gun. An exception proves a great deal, but all the same, most men, whether they have a chance or not, love to hunt. Hunters, therefore, there are of many degrees. Hunters of the lowly cottontail and the woodland squirrel, hunters of quail, woodcock, and grouse, hunters of wild ducks and geese, hunters of foxes, the red-coated English, and the homespun-clad American, hunters, which is a kinder name for trappers, of beaver, marten, otter, mink, all the furred animals, hunters of deer, cat, wolf, bear, antelope, elk, moose, caribou, hunters of the barren lands where the ice is king and where there are polar bears, white foxes, musk ox, walrus, hunters of different animals of different countries, African hunters for lion, rhinoceros, elephant, buffalo, eland, hartebeest, giraffe, and 100 species made known to all the world by such classical sportsmen as Selous, Roosevelt, Stuart, Edward White. But they are all hunters, and their game is the deadly chase in the open or the wild. There are hunters who hate action, who hate to walk and climb and toil and wear themselves out to get a shot. Such men are hunters still, but still not men. There are hunters who have game driven up to them. I heard a story told by an officer whom I believe. In the early days of the war he found himself somewhere on the border between Austria and Germany. He was invited to a hunt by a personage of high degree. They motored to a sequestered palace in the forest, and next day motored to a shooting lodge. At daylight he was called and taken to the edge of a forest and stationed in an open glade. His stand was an upholstered divan placed high in the forks of a tree. His guide told him that pretty soon a doe would come out of the forest, but he was not to shoot it. In 15 minutes a lame buck would come out, but he was not to shoot that one either. In 10 more minutes another buck would come out, and this third deer he was to kill. My informant told me this was all very seriously meant. The gun given him was large enough in caliber to kill an elephant. He walked up the steps to the comfortable divan and settled himself to await events. The doe trotted out exactly on scheduled time. So did the lame buck. They came from the woods and were not frightened. The third deer, a large buck, was a few moments late, 3 minutes to be exact. According to instructions, the American killed this buck, a matter that took some nerve, he said, for the buck walked out like a cow. That night a big supper was given in the guest's honor. He had to eat certain parts of the buck he had killed, and drink flagons of wine. This kind of hunting must be peculiarly German or Austrian, and illustrates the peculiar hunting ways of men. A celebrated bear hunter and guide of the Northwest told me that for 20 years he had been taking Eastern ministers, preachers of the gospel, on hunting trips into the wild. He assured me that of all the bloody murderers, waders in gore, as he expressed it, these teachers of the gospel were the worst. The moment they got out into the wild they wanted to kill, kill, kill. He averred their natures seemed utterly to change. In reading the books of hunters and in listening to their talks at campfire club dinners, I have always been struck with the expression of what these hunters felt, what they thought they got out of hunting. The change from city to the open wilderness, the difference between noise, tumult, dirt, foul air, and the silence, the quiet, the cleanness and purity, the sweet breath of God's country, as so many called it, the beauty of forest and mountain, the wildness of ridge and valley, the wonder of wild animals in their native haunts, and the zest, the joy, the excitement, the magnificent thrill of the stalk and the chase. No one of them ever dwelt upon the kill. It was mentioned as a result, an end, a consummation. How strange that hunters believed these were the attractions of the chase! They felt them, to be sure, in some degree, or they would not remember them, but they never realized that these sensations were only incidental to hunting. Men take long rides, hundreds and thousands of miles, to hunt. They endure hardships, live in camps with absolute joy. They stalk through the forest, climb the craggy peaks, labor as giants in the building of the pyramids, all with a tight clutch on a deadly rifle. They are keen, intent, strained, quiveringly eager, all with a tight clutch on a deadly rifle. If hunters think while on a stalk, which matter I doubt considerably, they think about the lay of the land, or the aspect of it, of the habits and possibilities of their quarry, of their labor and chances, and particularly of the vague, unrealized sense of comfort, pleasure, satisfaction in the moment. Tight muscles, alert eyes, stealthy steps, stalk and run and crawl and climb, breathlessness, a hot, close-pressed chest, thrill on thrill, and sheer bursting riot of nerve and vein. These are the ordinary sensations and actions of a hunter. No ascent too lofty, no descent too perilous for him then, if he is a man as well as a hunter. Take the Brazilian hunter of the jungle. He is solitary. He is sufficient to himself. He is a survival of the fittest. The number of his tribe are few. Nature sees to that. But he must eat, and therefore he hunts. He spears fish, and he kills birds and beasts with a blowgun. He hunts to live. But the manner of his action, though more skillful, is the same as any hunter's. Likewise his sensations, perhaps more vivid, because hunting for him is a matter of life or death. Take the gaucho of Patagonia, the silent, lonely Indian hunter of the Pampas. He hunts with a bola, a thin thong or string, at each end of which is a heavy leather-covered ball of stone or iron. This the gaucho hurls through the air at the neck or legs of his quarry. The balls fly round, the thong binds tight. It is a deadly weapon. The user of it rides and stalks and sees and throws, and feels the same as any other hunter. Time and place, weapon and game have little to do with any differences in hunters. Up to this 1919 hunting trip in the wilds, I had always marveled at the fact that naturalists and biologists hate sportsmen. Not hunters like the Yellowknife Indians, or the snake-eating Bushmen of Australia, or the Terra del Fuegans, or even the native country rabbit hunters, but the so-called sportsmen. Naturalists and biologists have simply learned the truth why men hunt, and that when it is done in the name of sport or for sensation, it is a degenerate business. Stevenson wrote beautiful words about the hunter home from the hill, but so far as I can find out, he never killed anything himself. He was concerned with the romance of the thought, with alliteration and the singular charm of the truth. Sunset and the end of the day, the hunter's plod down the hill to the cottage, to the home where wife and children awaited him. Indeed, it is a beautiful truth, and not altogether in the past, for there are still farmers and pioneers. Hunting is a savage, primordial instinct inherited from our ancestors. It goes back through all the ages of man, and farther still, to the age when man was not man, but hairy ape, or some other beast from which we are descended. To kill is in the very marrow of our bones. If man, after he developed into human state, had taken to vegetable diet, which he never did take, he yet would have inherited the flesh-eating instincts of his animal forebears, and no instinct is ever wholly eradicated. But man was a meat-eater. By brute strength, by sagacity, by endurance, he killed in order to get the means of subsistence. If he did not kill, he starved. And it is a matter of record, even down to modern times, that man has existed by cannibalism. The caveman stalked from his hole under a cliff, boldly forth with his huge club or stone mace. Perhaps he stole his neighbor's woman, but if so, he had more reason to hunt than before. He had to feed her as well as himself. This cave-man, savagely descended, savagely surrounded, must have had to hunt all the daylight hours, and surely had to fight to kill his food, or to keep it after he killed it. Long, long ages was the being called cave-man in developing. More long ages he lived on the earth in that dim, dark, mystic past, and just as long were his descendants growing into another and higher type of barbarian. But they and their children and grandchildren and all their successive, innumerable, and varying descendants had to hunt meat and eat meat to live. The brain of barbarian man was small, as shown by the size and shape of his skull, but there is no reason to believe its construction and use were any different from the use of other organs: the eye to see with, the ear to hear with, the palate to taste with. Whatever the brain of primitive man was, it held at birth unlimited and innumerable instincts like those of its progenitors, and round and smooth in babyhood as it was, it surely gathered its sensations one after another in separate and habitual channels, until when manhood arrived it had its convolutions, its folds and wrinkles. And if instinct and tendency were born in the brain, how truly must they be a part of bone, tissue, blood. We cannot escape our inheritance. Civilization is merely a veneer, a thin-skinned polish over the savage and crude nature. Fear, anger, lust, the three great primal instincts, are restrained, but they live powerfully in the breast of man. Self-preservation is the first law of human life, and is included in fear. Fear of death is the first instinct. Then, if for thousands, perhaps millions of years, man had to hunt because of his fear of death, had to kill meat to survive, consider the ineradicable and permanent nature of the instinct. The secret now of the instinctive joy and thrill and wildness of the chase lies clear. Stealing through the forest or along the mountain slope, eyes roving, ears sensitive to all vibrations of the air, nose as keen as that of a hound, hands tight on a deadly rifle, we unconsciously go back. We go back to the primitive, to the savage state of man. Therein lies the joy. How sweet, vague, unreal those sensations of strange familiarity with the wild places we know we never saw before. But 1,000,000 years before that hour, a hairy ancestor of ours felt the same way in the same kind of a place, and in us that instinct survives. That is the secret of the wonderful, strange charm of wild places, of the barren rocks of the desert wilderness, of the great walled, lonely canyons. Something now in our blood, in our bones, once danced in men who lived then in similar places, and lived by hunting. The child is father to the man. In the light of this instinct, how easy to understand his boyish cruelty. He is true to nature. Unlimited and infinite in his imagination when he hunts, whether with his toys or with real weapons. If he flings a stone and kills a toad, he is instinctively killing meat for his home in the cave. How little difference between the lad and the man! For a man, the most poignantly exciting, the most thrillingly wild, is the chase when he is weaponless, when he runs and kills his quarry with a club. Here we have the essence of the matter. The hunter is proudest of his achievement in which he has not had the help of deadly weapons. Unconsciously he will brag and glow over that conquest wherein lay greatest peril to him, when he had nothing but his naked hands, when a hot gush of blood bursts over him. He goes back to his barbarian state when a man only felt. The savage lived in his sensations. He saw, heard, smelled, tasted, touched, but seldom thought. The earthy, the elemental of eye and ear and skin surrounded him. When the man goes into the wilderness to change into a hunter, that surviving kinship with the savage revives in his being, and all unconsciously dominates him with driving passion. Passion it is because for long he has been restrained in the public haunts of men. His real nature has been hidden. The hunting of game inhibits his thoughts. He feels only. He forgets himself. He seeks the track. He hears the stealthy step. He smells the wild scent, and his blood dances with the dance of the ages. Then he is a killer. Then the ages roll back. Then he is brother to the savage. Then all unconsciously he lives the chase, the fight, the death-dealing moment as they were lived by all his ancestors down through the misty past. What, then, should be the attitude of a thoughtful man toward this liberation of an instinct, that is to say, toward the game or sport or habit of hunting to kill? Not easily could I decide this for myself. After all, life is a battle. Eternally we are compelled to fight. If we do not fight, if we do not keep our bodies strong, supple, healthy, soon we succumb to some germ or other that gets a hold in our blood or lungs and fights for its life, its species, until it kills us. Fight, therefore, is absolutely necessary to long life, and alas, eventually that fight must be lost. The savages, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, all worshipped physical prowess in man, manhood, strength, the symbols of fight. To be physically strong and well, a man must work hard, with frequent intervals of change of exercise, and he must eat meat. I am not a great meat eater, but I doubt if I could do much physical labor or any brain work on a vegetable diet. Therefore I hold it fair and manly to go once a year to the wilderness to hunt. Let that hunt be clean, hard toil, as hard as I can stand. Perhaps nature created the lower animals for the use of man. If I had been the creator, I think I would have made it possible for the so-called higher animal, man, to live on air. Somewhere I read a strange, remarkable story about monkeys and priests in the jungle of India. An old order of priests had from time out of mind sent 2 of their comrades into the jungle to live with the monkeys, to tame them, feed them, study them, love them. And these priests told an incredible story, yet one that haunted with its possibilities of truth. After a long term of years in which one certain priest had lived with the monkeys, and they had learned truly he meant them no harm, and only loved them, at rare moments an old monkey would come to him and weep in the most terrible and tragic manner. This monkey wanted to tell something, but could not speak. But the priest knew that the monkey was trying to tell him how once the monkey people had been human like him. Only they had retrograded in the strange scale of evolution, and the terrible weeping was for loss of physical stature, of speech, perhaps of soul. What a profound and stunning idea! Does evolution work backward? Could nature, in its relentless, inscrutable design for the unattainable perfection, have developed man only to start him backward toward the dim ages whence he sprang? Who knows? But every man can love wild animals. Every man can study and try to understand the intelligence of his horse, the loyalty of his dog. And every hunter can hunt less with his instinct and more with an understanding of his needs and a consideration for the beasts only the Creator knows. Chapter 4, Tales of Lonely Trails by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4, Tonto Basin, Part 11. The last day of everything always comes. Time, like the tide, waits for no man. Anticipation is beautiful, but it is best and happiest to enjoy the present, live while we may. On this last day of my hunt we were up almost before it was light enough to see. The morning star shone radiant in the dark gray sky. All the other stars seemed dimmed by its glory. Silent as a grave was the forest. I started a fire, chopped wood so vigorously that I awakened Nielsen, who came forth like a burly caveman, and I washed hands and face in the icy cold brook. By the time breakfast was over, the gold of the rising sun was tipping the highest pines on the ridges. We started on foot, leaving the horses hobbled near camp. All the hounds appeared fit. Even Old Dan trotted along friskily. Pyle, a neighbor of Haught's, had come to take a hunt with us, bringing 2 dogs with him. For this last day I had formulated a plan. Ed and one of the boys were to take the hounds down on the east side of the great ridge that made the eastern wall of Dude Canyon. R.C. was to climb out on this ridge and take his position at the most advantageous point. We had already chased 6 bears over this saddle, one of which was the big frosty-coated grizzly that Ed and Nielsen had shot at. The rest of us hurried to the head of Dude Canyon. Copple and I were to go down to the first promontories under the rim. The others were to await developments and go where Haught thought best to send them. Copple and I started down over and around the crags, going carefully until we reached the open slope under the rim rock. It seemed this morning that I was fresh, eager, agile, like a goat on my feet. In my consciousness of this, I boasted to Copple that I would dislodge fewer stones and so make less noise than he. The canyon sloped at an angle of about 45 degrees, and we slid, stepped, jumped, and ran down without starting an avalanche. When we descended to the first bare cape of projecting rock, the hour was the earliest in which I had been down under the rim. All the canyon and the great green gulf below were unusually fresh and beautiful. I heard the lonely call of strange birds and the low murmur of running water. An eagle soared in the sunlight. High above us to the east rose the magnificent slope of Dude Canyon. I gazed up to the black and green and silver ascent, up to the gold-tipped craggy crest where R.C. had his stand. I knew he could see me, but I could not see him. Afterward he told me that my red cap shone clearly out of green and gray, so he had no difficulty in keeping track of my whereabouts. The thickets of aspens and oaks seemed now to stand on end. How dark in the shade and steely and cold they looked! That giant ridge still obstructed the sun, and all on this side of it, under its frowning crest and slope, was dark and fresh and cool in shadow. The ravines were choked black with spruce trees. Here along this gray, shady slant of wall, in niches and cracks and under ledges and on benches, were the beds of the bears. Even as I gazed momentarily, I expected to see a bear. It looked 200 yards across the canyon from where we stood, but Copple declared it was 1,000. On our other side, capes and benches and groves were bright in sunshine, clear across the rough breaks to the west of Dude Canyon. I saw a flock of wild pigeons below. Way out and beyond rolled the floor of the basin, green and vast, like a ridged sea of pines, to the bold black of mazatzals so hauntingly beckoning from the distance. Copple spoke now and then, but I wanted to be silent. How wild and wonderful this place in the early morning! But I had not long to meditate and revel in beauty and wildness. Far down across the mouth of the canyon, at the extreme southern end of that vast oak thicket, the hounds gave tongue. Old Dan first. In the still, cool air, how his great wolf bay rang out the wildness of the time and place. Already Ed and Pyle had rounded the end of the east ridge and were coming up along the slope of Dude Canyon. "Hounds working round," declared Copple. "Now I'll tell you what. Last night a bear was feeding along that end of the thicket. The hounds are milling round trying to straighten out his trail. It's a dead cinch they'll jump a bear, and we'll see 'em." "Look everywhere," I cautioned Copple, and my eyes roved and strained over all that vast slope. Suddenly I espied the flash of something black, far down the thicket, and tried to show it to my comrade. "Let's go round and down to that lower point of rock. It's a better stand than this, closer to the thicket, and commands those. By golly, I see what you see. There's a bear, slipping down. Stay with me now." Staying with Copple was a matter of utter disregard of clothes, limbs, life. He plunged off that bare ledge, slid flat on his back, and wormed feet first under manzanita, and gaining open slope, got up to run and jump into another thicket. By staying with him I saw that I would have a way opened through the brush and something to fall upon if I fell. He rimmed the edge of a deep gorge that made me dizzy. He leaped cracks. He let himself down over a ledge by holding to bushes. He found steps to descend little bluffs, and he flew across the open slides of weathered rock. I was afraid this short-cut to the lower projecting cape of rock would end suddenly on some impassable break or cliff, but though the travel grew rough, we still kept on. I wore only boots, trousers, and shirt and cap, with cartridge belt strapped tight around me. It was a wonder I was not stripped. Some of my rags went to decorate the wake we left down that succession of ledges, but we made it, with me at least, bruised and ragged, dusty and choked, and absolutely breathless. My body burned as with fire. Hot sweat ran in streams down my chest. At last we reached the bare, flat, projecting cape of rock, and indeed it afforded an exceedingly favorable outlook. I had to sink down on the rock. I could not talk until I got my breath, but I used my eyes to every advantage. Neither Copple nor I could locate the black moving object we had seen from above. We were much closer to the hounds, though they still were baying a tangled cross-trail. Fortunate it was for me that I was given these few moments to rest from my tremendous exertions. My eyes searched the leaf-covered slopes, so brown and sere, and the shaggy thickets, and tried to pierce the black tangle of spruce patches. All at once, magically it seemed, my gaze held to a dark shadow, a bit of dense shade, under a large spruce tree. Something moved. Then a big bear rose right out of his bed of leaves, majestically as if disturbed, and turned his head back toward the direction of the baying hounds. Next he walked out. He stopped. I was quivering with eagerness to tell Copple, but I waited. Then the bear walked behind a tree and peeped out, only his head showing. After a moment, again he walked out. "Ben, aren't you ever going to see him?" I cried at last. "What?" ejaculated Copple in surprise. "Bear," and I pointed, "this side of Dead Spruce." "I reckon you see a stump." "Oh, by golly, I see him. He's a dandy, reddish color. Doc, he's one of them mean old cinnamons." "Watch. What will he do? Ben, he hears the hounds." How singularly thrilling to see him! How slowly he walked, how devoid of fear, how stately. "Sure he hears them. See him look back? The son of a gun! I'll bet he's given us the bear laugh more than once." "Ben, how far away is he?" I asked. "Oh, that's 800 yards," declared Copple. "A long shot. Let's wait. He may work down closer, but most likely he'll run uphill." "If he climbs, he'll go right to R.C.'s stand," I said, gazing upward. "Sure will. There's no other saddle." Then I decided that I would not shoot at him unless he started down. My excitement was difficult to control. I found it impossible to attend to my sensations, to think about what I was feeling. But the moment was full of suspense. The bear went into a small clump of spruces and stayed there a little while. Tantalizing moments. The hounds were hot upon his trail, still working to and fro in the oak thicket. I judged scarcely a mile separated them from the bear. Again he disappeared behind a little bush. Remembering that 5 pairs of sharp eyes could see him from the points above, I stood up and waved my red cap. I waved it wildly, as a man waves a red flag in moments of danger. Afterward R.C. said he saw me plainly and understood my action. Again the bear had showed, this time on an open slide, where he had halted. He was looking across the canyon while I waved my cap. "Ben, could he see us so far?" I asked. "By golly, I'll bet he does see us. You get to smoking him up, and if you hit him, don't be nervous if he starts for us. Cinnamons are bad customers. Lay out 5 extra shells and make up your mind to kill him." I dropped upon one knee. The bear started down, coming towards us over an open slide. "Aim a little course and follow him," said Copple. I did so, and tightening all my muscles into a ball, holding my breath, I fired. The bear gave a savage kick backwards. He jerked back to bite at his haunch. A growl, low, angry, vicious, followed the echoes of my rifle. Then it seemed he pointed his head toward us and began to run down the slope, looking our way all the time. "By golly!" yelled Copple, "you stung him one, and he's a-comin'. Now you've got to shoot some. He can roll downhill and run uphill like a jackrabbit. Take your time, wait for open shots, and make sure." Copple's advice brought home to me what could happen even with the advantage on my side. Also it brought the cold, tight prickle to my skin, the shudder that was not a thrill, the pressure of blood running too swiftly. I did not feel myself shake, but the rifle was unsteady. I rested an elbow on my knee, yet still I had difficulty in keeping the sight on him. I could get it on him, but could not keep it there. Again he came out into the open, at the head of a yellow slide that reached to a thicket below. I must not hurry. Yet I had to hurry. After all, he had not so far to come, and most of the distance was under cover. Through my mind flashed Haught's story of a cinnamon that kept coming with 10 bullets in him. "Doc, he's paddin' along," warned Copple. "Smoke some of them shells." Straining every nerve, I aimed as before, only a little in advance, held tight, and pulled at the same instant. The bear doubled up in a ball and began to roll down the slide. He scattered the leaves. Then into the thicket he crashed, knocking the oaks and cracking the brush. "Some shot!" yelled Copple. "He's your bear." But my bear continued to crash through the brush. I shot again and yet again, missing both times. Apparently he was coming, faster now, and then he showed dark almost at the foot of our slope. Trees were thick there. I could not see there, and I could not look for bear and reload at the same moment. My fingers were not very nimble. "Don't shoot," shouted Copple. "He's your bear. I never make any mistakes when I see game hit." "But I see him coming." "Where?" "By golly, that's another bear. He's black. Yours is red. Look sharp. Next time he shows, smoke him." I saw a flash of black across an open space. I heard a scattering of gravel. But I had no chance to shoot. Then both of us heard a bear running in thick leaves. "He's gone down the canyon," said Copple. "Now look for your bear." "Listen, Ben. The hounds are coming fast. There's Rock. There's Sue." "I see 'em. Old Dan. What do you think of that old dog? There. Your red bear's still comin'. He's bad hurt." Though Copple tried hard to show me where, and I strained my eyes, I could not see the bear. I could not locate the threshing of brush. I knew it seemed close enough for me to be glad I was not down in that thicket. How the hounds made the welkin ring! Rock was in the lead, Sue was next, and old Dan must have found the speed of his best days. Strange he did not bay all down that slope. When Rock and Sue headed the bear, then I saw him. He sat up on his haunches ready to fight, but they did not attack him. Instead, they began to yelp wildly. I dared not shoot again for fear of hitting one of them. Old Dan just beat the rest of the pack to the bear. Up pealed a yelping chorus. I had never heard old Dan bay a bear at close range. With deep, hoarse, quick, wild roars, he dominated that medley. A box canyon took up the bays, crackling them back in echo from wall to wall. From the saddle of the great ridge above pealed down R.C.'s "Wah-oo!" I saw him silhouetted dark against the sky line. He waved, and I answered, and then he disappeared. Nielsen bellowed from the craggy cape above and behind us. From down the canyon Ed sent up his piercing "Ki-yi!" Then Takahashi appeared opposite to us, like a goat on a promontory. How his "Banzai!" rang above the baying of the hounds. "We'd better hurry down and across," said Copple. "Reckon the hounds will jump that bear, or someone else will get there first. We gotta skedaddle." As before, we fell into a manzanita thicket and had to crawl. Then we came out upon a rim of a box canyon where the echoes made such a din. It was too steep to descend. We had to head it, and Copple took chances. Loose boulders tripped me, and stout bushes saved me. We knocked streams of rock and gravel down into this gorge, sending up a roar as of falling water. But we got around. A steep slope lay below, all pine needles and leaves. From this point I saw Ed on the opposite slope. "I stopped one bear," I yelled. "Hurry! Look out for the dogs!" Then, imitating Copple, I sat down and slid as on a toboggan for some 30 thrilling yards. Some of my anatomy and more of my rags I left behind me. But it was too exciting then to think of hurts. I managed to protect at least my rifle. Copple was charging into the thicket below. I followed him into the dark gorge, where huge boulders lay, and a swift brook ran, and leaves 2 feet deep carpeted the shady canyon bed. It was gloomy down into the lower part. I saw where Bear had turned over the leaves, making a dark track. "The hounds have quit," called Copple suddenly. "I told you he was your bear." We yelled. Somebody above us answered. Then we climbed up the opposite slope, through a dense thicket, crossing a fresh bear track, a running track, and soon came into an open rocky slide, where my bear lay surrounded by the hounds, with old Dan on guard. The bear was red in color, with silky fur, a long keen head, and fine limbs, and of goodly size. "Cinnamon," declared Copple, and turning him over he pointed to a white spot on his breast. "Fine bear, about 400 pounds. Maybe not so heavy, but he'll take some packing up to the rim." Then I became aware of the other men. Takahashi had arrived on the scene first, finding the bear dead. Ed came next, and after him Pyle. I sat down for a much-needed rest. Copple interested himself in examining the bear, finding that my first shot had hit him in the flank, and my second had gone through the middle of his body. Next, Copple amused himself by taking pictures of bear and hounds. Old Dan came to me and lay beside me, and looked as if to say, "Well, we got him." Yells from both sides of the canyon were answered by Ed. R.C. was rolling the rocks on his side at a great rate, but Nielsen on the other side beat him to us. The Norwegian crashed the brush, sent the avalanches roaring, and eventually reached us, all dirty, ragged, bloody, with fire in his eye. He had come all the way from the rim in short order. What a performance that must have been! He said he thought he might be needed. R.C., guided by Ed's yells, came cracking the brush down to us. Pale he was and wet with sweat, and there were black brush marks across his face. His eyes were keen and sharp. He had started down for the same reason as Nielsen's, but he had to descend a slope so steep that he had to hold on to keep from sliding down. And he had jumped a big bear out of a bed of leaves. The bed was still warm. R.C. said he had smelled the bear, and that his toboggan slide down that slope, with bears all around for all he knew, had started the cold sweat on him. Presently George Haught joined us, having come down the bed of the canyon. "We knew you'd got a bear," said George. "Father heard the first 2 bullets hit me, and I heard him rolling down the slope." "Well," exclaimed R.C., "that's what made those first 2 shots sound so strange to me. Different from the last 2. Sounded like soft, dead pats, and it was lead hitting flesh. I heard it half a mile away." This matter of the sound of bullets hitting flesh and being heard at a great distance seemed to me the most remarkable feature of our hunt. Later I asked Haught. He said he heard my first 2 bullets strike, and believed from the peculiar sound that I had my bear, and his stand was fully a mile away. But the morning was unusually still, and sound carried far. The men hung my bear from the forks of a maple. Then they decided to give us time to climb up to our stands before putting the hounds on the other fresh trail. Nielsen, R.C., and I started to climb back up to the points. Only plenty of time made it possible to scale those rugged bluffs. Nielsen distanced us, and eventually we became separated. The sun grew warm. The bees hummed. After a while we heard the baying of the hounds. They were working westward under the bases of the bluffs. We rimmed the heads of several gorges, climbed and crossed the west ridge of Dude Canyon, and lost the hounds somewhere as we traveled. R.C. did not seem to mind this misfortune any more than I. We were content. Resting a while, we chose the most accessible ridge and started the long climb to the rim. Westward under us opened a great noble canyon full of forests, thicketed slopes, cliffs and caves and crags. Next time we rested, we again heard the hounds, far away at first, but gradually drawing closer. In half an hour they appeared right under us again. Their baying, however, grew desultory and lacked the stirring note. Finally we heard Ed calling and whistling to them. After that, for a while, all was still. Then pealed up the clear, tuneful melody of Ed's horn, calling off the chase for that day and season. "All over," said R.C. "Are you glad?" "For old Dan's sake and Tom's and the bears, yes," I replied. "Me too, but I'd never get enough of this country." We proceeded on our ascent over and up the broken masses of rock, climbing slowly and easily, making frequent and long rests. We liked to linger in the sun on the warm, piney, mossy benches. Every shady cedar or juniper wooed us to tarry a moment. Old bear tracks and fresh deer tracks held the same interest, though our hunt was over. Above us the gray, broken mass of rim towered and loomed, more formidable as we neared it. Sometimes we talked a little, but mostly we were silent. Like an Indian, at every pause I gazed out into the void. How sweeping and grand the long sloping lines of ridges from the rim down! Away in the east, ragged spurs of peaks showed hazily, like uncertain mountains on the desert. South ranged the upheaved and wild Mazatzals. Everywhere beneath me, for leagues and leagues, extended the timbered hills of green, the gray outcroppings of rock, the red bluffs, the golden patches of grassy valleys, lost in the canyons. All these swept away in a vast billowy ocean of wilderness to become dim in the purple of distance, and the sun was setting in a blaze of gold. From the rim I took a last lingering look, and Chapter 5 of Tales of Lonely Trails by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5, Death Valley. Of the 557,000 square miles of desert land in the southwest, Death Valley is the lowest below sea level, the most arid and desolate. It derives its felicitous name from the earliest days of the gold strike in California, when a caravan of Mormons, numbering about 70, struck out from Salt Lake to cross the Mojave Desert and make a short cut to the gold fields. All but 2 of these prospectors perished in the deep, iron-walled, ghastly sinkholes which from that time became known as Death Valley. The survivors of this fatal expedition brought news to the world that the somber Valley of Death was a treasure mine of minerals, and since then hundreds of prospectors and wanderers have lost their lives there. To seek gold and live in the lonely waste places of the earth have been and ever will be driving passions of men. My companion on this trip was a Norwegian named Nielsen. On most of my trips to lonely and wild places I have been fortunate as to comrades or guides. The circumstances of my meeting Nielsen were so singular that I think they will serve as an interesting introduction. Some years ago I received a letter, brief, clear, and well written, in which the writer stated that he had been a wanderer over the world, a sailor before the mast, and was now a prospector for gold. He had taken 4 trips alone down into the desert of Sonora, and in many other places of the Southwest, and knew the prospecting game. Somewhere he had run across my story, Desert Gold, in which I told about a lost gold mine, and the point of his letter was that if I could give him some idea as to where the lost gold mine was located, he would go find it and give me half. His name was Sivert Nielsen. I wrote him that to my regret the lost gold mine existed only in my imagination, but if he would come to Avalon to see me, perhaps we might both profit by such a meeting. To my surprise he came. He was a man of about 35, of magnificent physique, weighing about 190, and he was so enormously broad across the shoulders that he did not look his 5 feet 10. He had a wonderful head, huge, round, solid, like a cannonball, and his bronzed face, his regular features, square, firm jaw, and clear gray eyes, fearless and direct, were singularly attractive to me. Well educated, with a strange, calm poise, and a cool courtesy, not common in Americans, he evidently was a man of good family, by his own choice a rolling stone and adventurer. Nielsen accompanied me on 2 trips into the wilderness of Arizona, on one of which he saved my life, and on the other he rescued all our party from a most uncomfortable and possibly hazardous situation. But these are tales I may tell elsewhere. In January 1919, Nielsen and I traveled around the desert of Southern California from Palm Springs to Picacho, and in March we went to Death Valley. Nowadays a little railroad, the Tonopah and Tidewater Railroad, runs northward from the Santa Fe over the barren Mojave, and it passes within 50 miles of Death Valley. It was sunset when we arrived at Death Valley Junction, a weird, strange sunset in drooping curtains of transparent cloud, lighting up dark mountain ranges, some peaks of which were clear-cut and black against the sky, and others veiled in trailing storms, and still others white with snow. That night in the dingy little store I heard prospectors talk about float, which meant gold on the surface, and about high-grade ores, zinc, copper, silver, lead, manganese, and about how borax was mined 30 years ago and hauled out of Death Valley by teams of 20 mules. Next morning, while Nielsen packed the outfit, I visited the borax mill. It was the property of an English firm, and the work of hauling, grinding, roasting borax ore went on day and night. Inside, it was as dusty and full of powdery atmosphere as an old-fashioned flour mill. The ore was hauled by train from some 20 miles over toward the valley, and was dumped from a high trestle into chutes that fed the grinders. For an hour I watched this constant stream of borax as it slid down into the hungry crushers, and I listened to the chalk-faced operator who yelled in my ear. Once he picked a piece of gypsum out of the borax. He said the mill was getting out 2,500 sacks a day. The most significant thing he said was that men did not last long at such labor, and in the mines 6 months appeared to be the limit of human endurance. How soon I had enough of that choking air in the room where the borax was ground. And the place where the borax was roasted in huge round revolving furnaces, I found that intolerable. When I got into the cool, clean desert air, I felt an immeasurable relief, and that relief made me thoughtful of the lives of men who labored, who were chained by necessity, by duty or habit, or by love, to the hard tasks of the world. It did not seem fair. These laborers of the borax mines and mills, like the stokers of ships and coal diggers and blast furnace hands, like thousands and millions of men, killed themselves outright or impaired their strength, and when they were gone or rendered useless, others were found to take their places. Whenever I come in contact with some phase of this problem of life, I take the meaning or the lesson of it to myself. And as the years go by, my respect and reverence and wonder increase for these men of elemental lives, these horny-handed toilers with physical things, these uncomplaining users of brawn and bone, these giants who breast the elements, who till the earth and handle iron, who fight the natural forces with their bodies. That day about noon I looked back down the long gravel and greasewood slope which we had ascended, and I saw the borax mill, now only a smoky blot on the desert floor. When we reached the pass between the Black Mountains and the Funeral Mountains, we left the road and were soon lost to the works of man. How strange a gladness, a relief! Something dropped away from me. I felt the same subtle change in Nielsen. For one thing, he stopped talking, except an occasional word to the mules. The blunt end of the Funeral Range was as remarkable as its name. It sheered up very high, a saw-toothed range with colored strata tilted at an angle of 45 degrees. Zigzag veins of black and red and yellow, rather dull, ran through the great drab gray mass. This end of the range, an iron mountain, frowned down upon us with hard and formidable aspect. The peak was draped in streaky veils of rain from low-dropping clouds that appeared to have lodged there. All below lay clear and cold in the sunlight. Our direction lay to the westward, and at that altitude, about 3,000 feet, how pleasant to face the sun! For the wind was cold. The narrow, shallow wash leading down from the pass deepened, widened, almost imperceptibly at first, and then gradually until its proportions were striking. It was a gully where the gravel washed down during rains, and where a scant vegetation, greasewood and a few low cacti and scrubby sage, struggled for existence. Not a bird or lizard or living creature in sight. The trail was getting lonely. From time to time I looked back, because, as we could not see far ahead, all the superb scene spread and towered behind us. By and by our wash grew to be a wide canyon, winding away from under the massive, impondering wall of the Funeral Range. The high side of this magnificent and impressive line of mountains faced west, a succession of unscalable slopes of bare, ragged rock, jagged and jutted, dark drab, rusty iron, with gray and oblique strata running through them as far as I could see. Clouds soared around the peaks. Shadows sailed along the slopes. Walking in loose gravel was as hard as trudging along in sand. After about 15 miles I began to have leaden feet. I did not mind hard work, but I wanted to avoid overexertion. When I am extremely wearied, my feelings are liable to be colored somewhat by depression or melancholy. Then it always bothered me to get tired, while Nielsen kept on with his wonderful stride. "Say, Nielsen, do you take me for a Yaqui?" I complained. "Slow up a little." Then he obliged me, and to cheer me up he told me about a little tramping experience he had in Baja California. Somewhere on the east slope of the Sierra Madre his burros strayed or were killed by mountain lions, and he found it imperative to strike at once for the nearest ranch below the border, a distance of 150 miles. He could carry only so much of his outfit, and as some of it was valuable to him, he discarded all his food except a few biscuits and a canteen of water. Resting only a few hours, without sleep at all, he walked the 150 miles in 3 days and nights. I believed that Nielsen, by telling me such incidents of his own wild experience, inspired me to more endurance than I knew I possessed. As we traveled on down the canyon, its dimensions continued to grow. It finally turned to the left and opened out wide into a valley running west. A low range of hills faced us, rising in a long sweeping slant of earth, like the incline of a glacier, to rounded spurs. Halfway up this slope, where the brown earth lightened, there showed an outcropping of clay, amber and cream and cinnamon and green, all exquisitely vivid and clear. This bright spot appeared to be isolated. Far above it rose other clay slopes of variegated hues, red and russet and mauve and gray, and colors indescribably merged, all running in veins through this range of hills. We faced the west again, and descending this valley were soon greeted by a region of clay hills, bare, cone-shaped, fantastic in shade, slope, and ridge, with a high, sharp peak dominating all. The colors were mauve, taupe, pearl gray, all stained by a descending band of crimson, as if a higher slope had been stabbed to let its life blood flow down. The softness, the richness, and beauty of this texture of earth amazed and delighted my eyes. Quite unprepared, at time approaching sunset, we reached and rounded a sharp curve, to see down and far away, and to be held mute in our tracks. Between a white-mantled mountain range on the left and the dark-striped lofty range on the right, I could see far down into a gulf, a hazy void, a vast, stark valley that seemed streaked and ridged and canyoned, an abyss into which veils of rain were dropping, and over which broken clouds hung, pierced by red and gold rays. Death Valley! Far down and far away still, yet confounding at first sight. I gazed spellbound. It oppressed my heart. Nielsen stood like a statue, silent, absorbed for a moment. Then he strode on. I followed, and every second saw more and different aspects that could not, however, change the first stunning impression. Immense, unreal, weird. I went on down the widening canyon, looking into that changing void. How full of color! It smoked. The traceries of streams or shining white washes brightened the floor of the long dark pit. Patches and plains of white borax flats, or alkali, showed up like snow. A red haze, sinister and somber, hung over the eastern ramparts of this valley, and over the western drooped gray veils of rain, like thinnest lacy clouds, through which gleams of the sun shone. Nielsen plodded on, mindful of our mules, but I lingered, and at last checked my reluctant steps at an open high point with commanding and magnificent view. As I did not attempt the impossible, to write down thoughts and sensations, afterward I could remember only a few. How desolate and grand! The far-away, lonely, and terrible places of the earth were the most beautiful and elevating. Life's little day seemed so easy to understand, so pitiful. As the sun began to set, and the storm clouds moved across it, this wonderful scene darkened, changed every moment, brightened, grew full of luminous red light, and then streaked by golden gleams. The tips of the Panamint Mountains came out silver above the purple clouds. At sunset the moment was glorious, dark, forbidding, dim, weird, dismal, yet still tinged with gold. Not like any other scene. Dante's Inferno, valley of shadows, canyon of purple veils. When the sun had set, and all that upheaved and furrowed world of rock had received a mantle of gray, and a slumberous, sulphurous, ruddy haze slowly darkened to purple and black, then I realized more fully that I was looking down into Death Valley. Twilight was stealing down when I caught up with Nielsen. He had selected for our camp a protected nook near where the canyon floor bore some patches of sage, the stalks and roots of which would serve for firewood. We unpacked, fed the mule some grain, pitched our little tent, and made our bed all in short order. But it was dark long before we had supper. During the meal we talked a little, but afterward, when the chores were done and the mules had become quiet, and the strange, thick silence had settled down upon us, we did not talk at all. The night was black, with sky mostly obscured by clouds. A pale haze marked the west where the afterglow had faded. In the south one radiant star crowned a mountain peak. I strolled away in the darkness and sat down upon a stone. How intense the silence! Dead, vast, sepulchral-like, dreaming, waiting, a silence of ages, burdened with the history of the past. Awful. I strained my ears for sound of insect or rustle of sage or drop of weathered rock. The soft, cool desert wind was soundless. This silence had something terrifying in it, making me a man alone on the earth. The great spaces, the wild places as they had been millions of years before, I seemed to divine how through them man might develop from savage to a god, and how, alas, he might go back again. When I returned to camp, Nielsen had gone to bed, and the fire had burned low. I threw on some branches of sage. The fire blazed up, but it seemed different from other camp fires. No cheer, no glow, no sparkle. Perhaps it was owing to scant and poor wood. Still, I thought it was owing as much to the place. The sadness, the loneliness, the desolateness of this place weighed upon the camp fire, the same as it did upon my heart. We got up at 5:30. At dawn the sky was a cold, leaden gray, with a dull gold and rose in the east. A hard wind, eager and nipping, blew up the canyon. At 6 o'clock the sky brightened somewhat, and the day did not promise so threatening. An hour later we broke camp. Traveling in the early morning was pleasant, and we made good time down the winding canyon, arriving at Furnace Creek about noon, where we halted to rest. This stream of warm water flowed down from a gully that headed up in the Funeral Mountains. It had a disagreeable taste, somewhat acrid and soapy. A green thicket of brush was indeed welcome to the eye. It consisted of a rank, coarse kind of grass, and arrowweed, mesquite, and tamarack. The last named bore a pink fuzzy blossom, not unlike pussy willow, which was quite fragrant. Here the deadness of the region seemed further enlivened by several small birds, speckled and gray, 2 ravens, and a hawk. They all appeared to be hunting food. On a ridge above Furnace Creek we came upon a spring of poison water. It was clear, sparkling, with a greenish cast, and it deposited a white crust on the margins. Nielsen, kicking around in the sand, unearthed a skull, bleached and yellow, yet evidently not so very old. Some thirsty wanderer had taken his last drink at that deceiving spring. The gruesome and the beautiful, the tragic and the sublime, go hand in hand down the naked shingle of this desolate desert. While tramping around in the neighborhood of Furnace Creek, I happened upon an old, almost obliterated trail. It led toward the ridges of clay, and when I had climbed it a little ways, I began to get an impression that the slopes on the other side must run down into a basin or canyon. So I climbed to the top. The magnificent scenes of desert and mountain, like the splendid things of life, must be climbed for. In this instance I was suddenly and stunningly confronted by a yellow gulf of cone-shaped and fan-shaped ridges, all bare crinkly clay, of gold, of amber, of pink, of bronze, of cream, all tapering down to round-knobbed lower ridges, bleak and barren, yet wonderfully beautiful in their stark purity of denudation. Until at last, far down between two wildly separated hills, shone, dim and blue and ghastly, with shining white streaks like silver streams, the Valley of Death. Then beyond it climbed the league-long red slope, merging into the iron-buttressed base of the Panamint Range, and here, line on line and bulge on bulge, rose the bold benches, and on up the unscalable outcroppings of rock, like colossal ribs of the earth, on and up the steep slopes, to where their density of blue-black color began to thin out with streaks of white, and thence upward to the last noble height, where the cold, pure snow gleamed against the sky. I descended into this yellow maze, this world of gullies and ridges, where I found it difficult to keep from getting lost. I did lose my bearings, but as my boots made deep imprints in the soft clay, I knew it would be easy to backtrack my trail. After a while this labyrinthine series of channels and dunes opened into a wide space enclosed on three sides by denuded slopes, mostly yellow. These slopes were smooth, graceful, symmetrical, with thin tracery of erosion, and each appeared to retain its own color, yellow or cinnamon or mauve. But they were always dominated by a higher one of a different color, and this mystic region sloped and slanted to a great amphitheater that was walled on the opposite side by a mountain of bare earth, of every hue, and of 1,000 ribbed and scalloped surfaces. At its base the golds and russets and yellows were strongest, but ascending its slopes were changing colors, a dark, beautiful mouse color on one side, and a strange pearly cream on the other. Between these great corners of the curve climbed ridges of gray and heliotrope and amber, to meet wonderful veins of green, green as the sea in sunlight, and tracery of white, and on the bold face of this amphitheater, high up, stood out a zigzag belt of dull red, the stain of which had run down to tinge the other hues. Above all this wondrous coloration upheaved the bare breast of the mountain, growing darker with earthly browns up the gray old rock ramparts. This place affected me so strangely, so irresistibly, that I remained there a long time. Something terrible had happened there to men. I felt that. Something tragic was going on right then. The wearing down, the devastation of the old earth. How plainly that could be seen! Geologically it was more remarkable to me than the Grand Canyon. But it was the appalling meaning, the absolutely indescribable beauty that overcame me. I thought of those who had been inspiration to me in my work, and I suffered a pang that they could not be there to see and feel with me. On my way out of this amphitheater a hard wind swooped down over the slopes, tearing up the colored dust in sheets and clouds. It seemed to me each gully had its mystic pall of color. I lost no time climbing out. What a hot, choking ordeal! But I never would have missed it, even had I known I would get lost. Looking down again, the scene was vastly changed. A smoky, weird, murky hell, with the dull sun gleaming magenta-hued through the shifting pall of dust. In the afternoon we proceeded leisurely through an atmosphere growing warmer and denser, down to the valley, reaching it at dusk. We followed the course of Furnace Creek, and made camp under some cottonwood trees on the west slope of the valley. The wind blew a warm gale all night. I lay awake a while and slept with very little covering. Toward dawn the gale died away. I was up at 5:30. The morning broke fine, clear, balmy. A flare of pale gleaming light over the Funeral Range heralded the sunrise. The tips of the higher snow-capped Panamints were rose-colored, and below them the slopes were red. The bulk of the range showed dark. All these features gradually brightened until the sun came up. How blazing and intense! The wind began to blow again. Under the cottonwoods, with their rustling leaves and green so soothing to the eye, it was very pleasant. Beyond our camp stood green and pink thickets of tamarack and some dark velvety green alfalfa fields, made possible by the spreading of Furnace Creek over the valley slope. A man lived there and raised this alfalfa for the mules of the borax miners. He lived there alone, and his was indeed a lonely, wonderful, and terrible life. At this season a few Shoshone Indians were camped near, helping him in his labors. This lone rancher's name was Denton, and he turned out to be a brother of a Denton, hunter and guide, whom I had met in Lower California. Like all desert men, used to silence, Denton talked with difficulty, but the content of his speech made up for its brevity. He told us about the wanderers and prospectors he had rescued from death by starvation and thirst. He told us about the terrific noonday heat of summer, and about the incredible and horribly midnight furnace gales that swept down the valley. With the mercury at 125 degrees at midnight, below the level of the sea, when these furnace blasts bore down upon him, it was just all he could do to live. No man could spend many summers there. As for white women, Death Valley was fatal to them. The Indians spent the summers up on the mountains. Denton said heat affected men differently. Those who were meat-eaters or alcohol drinkers could not survive. Perfect heart and lungs were necessary to stand the heat and density of atmosphere below sea level. He told of a man who had visited his cabin and had left early in the day, vigorous and strong. A few hours later he was found near the oasis, unable to walk, crawling on his hands and knees, dragging a full canteen of water. He never knew what ailed him. It might have been heat, for the thermometer registered 135, and it might have been poison gas. Another man, young, of heavy and powerful build, lost 70 pounds weight in less than 2 days, and was nearly dead when found. The heat of Death Valley quickly dried up blood, tissue, bone. Denton told of a prospector who started out at dawn strong and rational, to return at sunset so crazy that he had to be tied to keep him out of the water. To have drunk his fill then would have killed him. He had to be fed water by spoonful. Another wanderer came staggering into the oasis, blind, with horrible face and black, swollen tongue protruding. He could not make a sound. He also had to be roped, as if he were a mad steer. I met only one prospector during my stay in Death Valley. He camped with us. A rather undersized man he was, yet muscular, with brown wrinkled face and narrow, dim eyes. He seemed to be smiling to himself most of the time. He liked to talk to his burros. He was exceedingly interesting. Once he nearly died of thirst, having gone from noon one day till next morning without water. He said he fell down often during this ordeal, but did not lose his senses. Finally the burros saved his life. This old fellow had been across Death Valley every month in the year. July was the worst. In that month crossing should not be attempted during the middle of the day. I made the acquaintance of the Shoshone Indians, or rather through Nielsen I met them. Nielsen had a kindly, friendly way with Indians. There were 6 families living in squalid tents. The braves worked in the fields for Denton, and the squaws kept to the shade with their numerous children. They appeared to be poor. Certainly they were a ragged, unpicturesque group. Nielsen and I visited them, taking an armload of canned fruit and boxes of sweet crackers, which they received with evident joy. Through this overture I got a peep into one of the tents. The simplicity and frugality of the desert Piute or Navajo were here wanting. These children of the open wore white men's apparel and ate white men's food, and they even had a cook stove and a sewing machine in their tent. With all that, they were trying to live like Indians. For me, the spectacle was melancholy. Another manifestation added to my long list of degeneration of the Indians by the whites. The tent was a buzzing beehive of flies. I never before saw so many. In a corner I saw a naked Indian baby asleep on a goat skin, all his brown, warm-tinted skin spotted black with flies. Later in the day one of the Indian men called upon us at our camp. I was surprised to hear him use good English. He said he had been educated in a government school in California. From him I learned considerable about Death Valley. As he was about to depart, on the way to his labor in the fields, he put his hand in his ragged pocket and drew forth an old beaded hat-band, and with calm dignity, worthy of any gift, he made me a present of it. Then he went on his way. The incident touched me. I had been kind. The Indian was not to be outdone. How that reminded me of the many instances of pride in Indians. Who yet has ever told the story of the Indian, the truth, the spirit, the soul of his tragedy? Nielsen and I climbed high up the west slope, to the top of a gravel ridge swept clean and packed hard by the winds. Here I sat down while my companion tramped curiously around. At my feet I found a tiny flower, so tiny as to almost defy detection. The color resembled sage gray, and it had the fragrance of sage. Hard to find and wonderful to see was its tiny blossom. The small leaves were perfectly formed, very soft, veined and scalloped, with a fine fuzz and a glistening sparkle. That desert flower of a day, in its isolation and fragility, yet its unquenchable spirit to live, was as great to me as the tremendous reddening bulk of the Funeral Mountains, looming so sinisterly over me. Then I saw some large bats with white heads flitting around in zigzag flights, assuredly new and strange creatures to me. I had come up there to this high ridge to take advantage of the bleak, lonely spot commanding a view of valley and mountains. Before I could compose myself to watch the valley, I made the discovery that near me were 6 low, gravelly mounds. Graves! One had 2 stones at head and foot. Another had no mark at all. The one nearest me had for the head a flat piece of board with lettering so effaced by weather that I could not decipher the inscription. The bones of a horse lay littered about between the graves. What a lonely place for graves! Death Valley seemed to be one vast sepulchre. What had been the lives and deaths of these people buried here? Lonely, melancholy, nameless graves upon the windy desert slope. By this time the long shadows had begun to fall. Sunset over Death Valley. A golden flare burned over the Panamints, long tapering, notched mountains with all their rugged conformation showing. Above floated gold and gray and silver-edged clouds. Below shone a whirl of dusty, ruddy bronze haze, gradually thickening. Dim veils of heat still rose from the pale desert valley. As I watched, all before me seemed to change and be shrouded in purple. How bold and desolate a scene! What vast scale and tremendous dimension! The clouds paled, turned rosy for a moment with the afterglow, then deepened into purple gloom. A somber, smoky sunset, as if this Death Valley was the gateway of hell, and its sinister shades were upflung from fire. The desert day was done, and now the desert twilight descended. Twilight of hazy purple fell over the valley of shadows. The black, bold lines of mountains ran across the sky and down into the valley and up on the other side. A buzzard sailed low in the foreground, fitting emblem of life in all that wilderness of suggested death. This fleeting hour was tranquil and sad. What little had it to do with the destiny of man? Death Valley was only a ragged rent of the old earth, from which men in their folly and passion had sought to dig forth golden treasure. The air held a solemn stillness. Peace! How it rested my troubled soul! I felt that I was myself here, far different from my habitual self. Why had I longed to see Death Valley? What did I want of the desert that was naked, red, sinister, somber, forbidding, ghastly, stark, dim and dark and dismal, the abode of silence and loneliness, the proof of death, decay, devastation, and destruction, the majestic sublimity of desolation? The answer was that I sought the awful, the appalling, and terrible, because they harked me back to a primitive day where my blood and bones were bequeathed their heritage of the elements. That was the secret of the eternal fascination the desert exerted upon all men. It carried them back. It inhibited thought. It brought up the age-old sensations, so that I could feel, though I did not know it then, once again the all-satisfying state of the savage in nature. When I returned to camp, night had fallen. The evening stars stood high in the pale sky, all alone and difficult to see, yet the more beautiful for that. The night appeared to be warmer, or perhaps it was because no wind blew. Nielsen got supper, and ate most of it, for I was not hungry. As I sat by the campfire, a flock of little bats, the smallest I had ever seen, darted from the woodpile nearby and flew right in my face. They had no fear of man or fire. Their wings made a soft swishing sound. Later I heard the trill of frogs, which was the last sound I might have expected to hear in Death Valley. A sweet, high-pitched, melodious trill. It reminded me of the music made by frogs in the Tamaulipas jungle of Mexico. Every time I awakened that night, and it was often, I heard this trill. Once, too, some time late, my listening ear caught faint, mournful notes of a killdeer. How strange, and still sweeter than the trill! What a touch to the infinite silence and loneliness! A killdeer, bird of the swamps and marshes, what could he be doing in arid and barren Death Valley? Nature is mysterious and inscrutable. Next morning the marvel of nature was exemplified even more strikingly. Out on the hard, gravel-strewn slope I found some more tiny flowers of a day. One was a white daisy, very frail and delicate, on a long, thin stem with scarcely any leaves. Another was a yellow flower with 4 petals, a pale miniature California poppy. Still another was a purple-red flower, almost as large as a buttercup, with dark green leaves. Last and tiniest of all were infinitely fragile pink and white blossoms on very flat plants, smiling wanly up from the desolate earth. Nielsen and I made known to Denton our purpose to walk across the valley. He advised against it. Not that the heat was intense at this season, he explained, but there were other dangers, particularly the brittle salty crust of the sink-hole. Nevertheless, we were not deterred from our purpose. So, with plenty of water in canteens and a few biscuits in our pockets, we set out. I saw the heat veils rising from the valley floor, at that point 178 feet below sea level. The heat lifted in veils, like thin smoke. Denton had told us that in summer the heat came in currents, in waves. It blasted leaves, burned trees to death, as well as men. Prospectors watched for the leaden haze that thickened over the mountains, knowing then no man could dare the terrible sun. That day would be a hazed and glaring hell, leaden, copper, with sun blazing a sky of molten iron. A long sandy slope of mesquite extended down to the bare, crinkly floor of the valley, and here the descent to a lower level was scarcely perceptible. The walking was bad. Little mounds in the salty crust made it hard to place a foot on the level. This crust appeared fairly strong, but when it rang hollow under our boots, then I stepped very cautiously. The color was a dirty gray and yellow. Far ahead I could see a dazzling white plain that looked like frost or a frozen river. The atmosphere was deceptive, making this plain seem far away, and then close at hand. The excessively difficult walking and the thickness of the air tired me, so I plumped myself down to rest, and used my notebook as a means to conceal from the tireless Nielsen that I was fatigued. Always I found this a very efficient excuse, and for that matter it was profitable for me. I have forgotten more than I have ever written. Rather overpowering indeed was it to sit on the floor of Death Valley, miles from the slopes that appeared so far away. It was flat, salty, alkali or borax ground, crusted and cracked. The glare hurt my eyes. I felt moist, hot, oppressed, in spite of a rather stiff wind. A dry odor pervaded the air, slightly like salty dust. Thin dust devils whirled on the bare flats. A valley-wide mirage shone clear as a mirror along the desert floor to the west, strange, deceiving, a thing both unreal and beautiful. The Panamint towered a wrinkled, red, gristly mass, broken by rough canyons, with long declines of talus-like brown glaciers, seamed and scarred, indestructible by past ages, yet surely wearing to ruin. From this point I could not see the snow on the peaks. The whole mountain range seemed an immense red barrier of beetling rock. The Funeral Range was farther away, and therefore more impressive. Its effect was stupendous. Leagues of brown chocolate slopes, scarred by slashes of yellow and cream, and shadowed black by sailing clouds, led up to the magnificently peaked and jutted summits. Splendid as this was, and reluctant as I felt to leave, I soon joined Nielsen, and we proceeded onward. At last we reached the white winding plain that had resembled a frozen river, and which from afar had looked so ghastly and stark. We found it to be a perfectly smooth stratum of salt, glistening as if powdered. It was not solid, not stable. At pressure of a boot it shook like jelly. Under the white crust lay a yellow substance that was wet. Here appeared an obstacle we had not calculated upon. Nielsen ventured out on it, and his feet sank in several inches. I did not like the wave of the crust. It resembled thin ice under a weight. Presently I ventured to take a few steps, and did not sink in so deeply or make such depression in the crusts as Nielsen. We returned to the solid edge and deliberated. Nielsen said that by stepping quickly we could cross without any great risk, though it appeared reasonable that by standing still a person would sink into the substance. "Well, Nielsen, you go ahead," I said with an attempt at lightness. "You weigh 190. If you go through, I'll turn back." Nielsen started with a laugh. The man courted peril. The bright face of danger must have been beautiful and alluring to him. I started after him, caught up with him, and stayed beside him. I could not have walked behind him over that strip of treacherous sinkhole. If I could have done so, the whole adventure would have been meaningless to me. Nevertheless, I was frightened. I felt the prickle of my skin, the stiffening of my hair, as well as the cold tingling thrills along my veins. The place was the lowest point of the valley in that particular location, and must have been upwards of 200 feet below sea level. The lowest spot, called the Sinkhole, lay some miles distant, and was the terminus of this river of salty white. We crossed it in safety. On the other side extended a long flat of upheaved crusts of salt and mud, full of holes and pitfalls, an exceedingly toilsome and painful place to travel, and, for all we could tell, dangerous too. I had all I could do to watch my feet and find surfaces to hold my steps. Eventually we crossed this broken field, reaching the edge of the gravel slope, where we were very glad indeed to rest. Denton had informed us that the distance was 7 miles across the valley at the mouth of Furnace Creek. I had thought it seemed much less than that, but after I had toiled across it I was convinced that it was much more. It had taken us hours. How the time had sped! For this reason we did not tarry long on that side. Facing the sun, we found the return trip more formidable. Hot indeed it was, hot enough for me to imagine how terrible Death Valley would be in July or August. On all sides the mountains stood up, dim and obscure and distant in haze. The heat veils lifted in ripples, and any object not near at hand seemed elusive. Nielsen set a pace for me on this return trip. I was quicker and surer of foot than he, but he had more endurance. I lost strength while he kept his unimpaired. So often he had to wait for me. Once when I broke through the crust, he happened to be close at hand and quickly hauled me out. I got one foot wet with some acid fluid. We peered down into the murky hole. Nielsen quoted a prospector saying, 40 feet from hell. That broken, sharp crust of salt afforded the meanest traveling I had ever experienced. Slopes of weathered rock that slip and slide are bad. Cacti, and especially cholla cacti, are worse. The jagged and corrugated surfaces of lava are still more hazardous and painful. But this cracked floor of Death Valley, with its salt crust standing on end like pickets of a fence, beat any place for hard going that either Nielsen or I had ever encountered. I ruined my boots, skinned my shins, cut my hands. How those salt cuts stung! We crossed the upheaved plain, then the strip of white, and reached the crinkly floor of yellow salt. The last hour taxed my endurance almost to the limit. When we reached the edge of the sand and the beginning of the slope, I was hotter and thirstier than I had ever been in my life. It pleased me to see Nielsen wringing wet and panting. He drank a quart of water apparently in one gulp, and it was significant that I took the longest and deepest drink of water that I had ever had. We reached the camp at the end of this still, hot summer day. Never had a camp seemed so welcome. What a wonderful thing it was to earn and appreciate and realize rest. The cottonwood leaves were rustling. Bees were humming in the tamarack blossoms. I lay in the shade, resting my burning feet and aching bones, and I watched Nielsen as he whistled over the camp chores. Then I heard the sweet song of a meadowlark, and after that the melodious deep note of a swamp blackbird. These birds evidently were traveling north and had tarried at the oasis. Lying there, I realized that I had come to love the silence, the loneliness, the serenity, even the tragedy of this valley of shadows. Death Valley was one place that could never be popular with men. It had been set apart for the hardy diggers for earthen treasures, and for the wanderers of the wastelands, men who go forth to seek and to find and to face their souls. Perhaps most of them found death. But there was a death in life. Desert travelers learned the secret that men lived too much in the world, that in silence and loneliness and desolation there was something infinite, something hidden from the crowd. End of Chapter 5.